There is something about Pokemon that never fully lets you go. Even if you haven't played in years, even if the cartridges are buried in a drawer somewhere gathering dust, the world still lives inside you. The sounds, the music, the feeling of pressing A on that tall grass and holding your breath. Today, we are going to move through 100 of the most overlooked, most hidden, most genuinely surprising facts the franchise has ever produced. These are the things the games never told you out loud, the things the anime quietly buried, the things that only the deepest corners of the fandom have ever unearthed. So, get comfortable, let this wash over you, because we are just getting started. Think about what you actually know about Pokemon. You probably know the starters by heart. You know the mascot. You know the broad strokes of how the games work and the general shape of the anime. But the franchise is almost 30 years old now, and it has been generating secrets, strange decisions, and buried details since before most of its current players were born. The amount of genuinely fascinating information that sits just beneath the surface of what most fans casually know could fill a library. So tonight, we are going to the library. We are pulling the dusty volumes off the back shelf, and we are going to take our time with them. Section 1, The Origins, where Pokemon actually came from. Before there was a Pikachu, before there was a Pokedex, a Pokeball, a rival standing in the doorway of a lab handing you a clipboard. Before any of that, there was a boy in the suburbs of Tokyo, lying in the grass and watching insects move through it. That boy was Satoshi Tajiri. He grew up in Machida, a city on the western edge of Tokyo, during a time when that part of Japan still had ponds and rice paddies and the kind of wild spaces where a curious child could spend entire days overturning rocks and catching beetles. Tajiri was obsessed with it, not in the casual way that most children have passing interests, but in the deep, consuming way where you fill notebooks and memorize names and spend every spare hour doing the thing you love. His neighbors called him Dr. Bug. His teachers were less impressed. He spent more time outside than in class, and his academic record was not the sort of thing that suggested a future building one of the most lucrative media franchises in human history. But that passion never left him. Even as Tokyo expanded outward through the 1970s and 1980s, swallowing the green spaces he loved, building over the ponds where he used to find aquatic insects, that feeling of wonder remained. The meadows became parking lots. The creeks got paved over, and Tajiri carried the loss of those places with him into adulthood, into his teenage obsession with arcade games, into his decision to start a handwritten gaming fanzine called Game Freak, and eventually, years later, into the design of a video game about collecting small creatures and trading them with friends. Fact 1. The name Capsule Monsters predates everything. Before the game was called Pocket Monsters, before it was shortened to Pokemon for international copyright reasons, Tajiri's original concept pitch was called Capumon, short for Capsule Monsters. The name came from a specific Japanese cultural phenomenon of the time. Gacha machines, those coin-operated vending machines in shopping centers and toy stores that dispense small plastic capsules containing random prizes. Tiny action figures, stickers, miniature monsters sealed inside a clear plastic ball. You put in your coin, you turned the crank, and you waited to see what you got. That sense of mystery and the thrill of the unknown was baked into Pokemon from its very conception. The Capsule Monsters pitch booklet, handwritten and illustrated by Tajiri and his collaborator Ken Sugimori in approximately 1990, described a game built around the Game Boy's link cable. The idea that two players could connect two separate handheld devices and exchange creatures was the entire mechanical heart of the concept. Not the battling, not the gym leaders, not the professor standing by a table and asking you whether you prefer a grass type, a fire type, or a water type. The foundation of Pokemon was connection, the joy of showing your friend what you found and trading something you had for something they had. Everything else grew out of that. Fact 2. The Game Freak magazine came before the game company. Before Tajiri ever designed a single Pokemon, he and Ken Sugimura ran a physical gaming magazine called Game Freak, which they sold at game centers and comic shops in Tokyo. It was a small publication, handwritten in places, stapled together, covering tips and reviews for arcade games. At its peak, it reached roughly 10,000 readers. When Tajiri eventually decided he wanted to make games rather than write about them, he simply renamed his magazine operation into a development studio. The name Game Freak came with him. It sits on the title screen of every mainline Pokémon game to this day. Fact 3. Ken Sugimori, the man who drew the original 151 Pokémon, came from that same fanzine background. He was not a trained illustrator in any formal sense. He was just extraordinarily talented, with a soft, rounded art style that gave early Pokémon their warm, approachable quality. Many of those original designs were drawn under enormous time pressure, with minimal hardware to display them. The Game Boy screen was tiny. Colors were not a factor at all in the original Japanese release, which came out as Pokémon Red and Green in February 1996. Sugimori had to design creatures that would read clearly in 4 shades of gray on a screen the size of a playing card. Think about what that constraint actually demanded creatively. A creature that relied on complex color patterns, fine detail work, or subtle shading for its identity would simply not be readable on that hardware. The designs that survived the filter were the ones with bold, clean silhouettes and enough visual punch to be immediately recognizable at a very small scale. This is part of why the original 151 have such enduring visual impact even today, on high-definition screens in completely different technological contexts. They were forged under pressure. Only the strongest shapes made it through. Fact 4. There were originally meant to be 190 Pokémon in Generation 1, not 151. In an interview, developer Shigeki Morimoto confirmed that 190 slots were allocated for Pokémon during early development of Red and Green. The final game shipped with 151. That means 39 creatures were cut somewhere between planning and release. The ghost slots those missing Pokémon left behind in the game's memory are part of the technical reason Missing Numbered exists. But we will come back to that in great detail a little later. Fact 5. The very first Pokémon ever designed as a sketch was not Pikachu. It was not Bulbasaur. It was not even Raiden, despite Raiden having the earliest position in the game's internal coding. According to Ken Sugimori, the first creature he fully sketched for the Capsule Monsters pitch was Clefairy, a round, pink, moon-shaped creature with little stubby arms and a curl of hair on its head. Clefairy was drawn before Pikachu existed, before Charizard, before any of the starters. And as you will discover later in this video, Clefairy almost became the mascot of the entire franchise instead of Shurshiju. Fact 6. Raiden, despite not being the earliest design, holds the distinction of being the first Pokémon coded into the game. Its internal ID number is 001 in the game's data, predating even Bulbasaur in terms of programming order. This is why early statues scattered across the Kanto region in Pokémon Red and Blue closely resemble Raiden. Those placeholder statue assets were built using the first available Pokémon model, and no one got around to replacing them before release. The persistence of Raiden's image in the game's architecture is a kind of fossil record of the development process. Everywhere you see those statues in Kanto, in gyms, in front of buildings, standing guard at entrances, you are looking at evidence of the order in which the game was assembled. Raiden was not chosen for those statues because it was iconic or important in the story. It was chosen because it was first in the database, and the person building the statue assets grabbed whatever was available. Accidental historical significance, encoded in stone. Fact 7. The development of Pokémon Red and Green took almost 6 full years from concept to release. Work began in earnest around 1990, and the game finally shipped in Japan on February 27, 1996. During that stretch, Tajiri essentially worked for free for long periods, surviving on money his family provided, while Nintendo's investment covered hardware costs. Multiple members of the small team quit because paychecks were inconsistent. There were months where nothing seemed to come together. The game was delayed repeatedly. Nintendo had serious doubts about whether it would sell. An executive is quoted as having called it a dinosaur, meaning it felt like old technology in a moment when the gaming industry was racing toward 3D and CD-ROM. But Tajiri refused to abandon it, and the game that nearly didn't happen went on to become the highest-grossing media franchise in history, generating an estimated $150 billion across all products, surpassing Star Wars and Harry Potter combined. The human cost of those 6 years is worth lingering on for a moment. Tajiri lived on his family's money for years. His team dwindled and reformed. The project existed on the belief of a handful of people who had every rational reason to stop, but didn't. The The specific quality of stubbornness required to push something like that to completion, to keep working on a Game Boy game about catching insects while the rest of the industry built polygonal 3D worlds, is not a romantic abstraction. It was a daily choice, made over and over, by people who were not yet sure the choice was right. Fact date. The Safari Zone mechanic, where players throw bait or rocks instead of engaging in standard battles, was directly inspired by Tajiri's childhood insect collecting. He wanted a section of the game that stripped away the combat layer and replaced it with the unpredictable tension of observing wild creatures in their habitat. You could not control the outcome. You could not guarantee a catch. The Safari Zone was designed to feel like crouching in a field, hoping a rare dragonfly would hold still long enough for you to get close. That loss of direct control was the entire point. The Safari Zone also contains one of the franchise's most counterintuitive mechanical secrets, which is that throwing bait or rocks doesn't necessarily improve your odds the way players assume. As we covered later in this video, the system was designed mainly to add unpredictability. Throwing bait can actually reduce overall catch rates, and rocks make Pokémon more likely to flee. The Safari Zone was not a puzzle to solve. It was a simulation of the feeling of being in the wild, where you are not in charge, where the thing you want might leave at any moment, where patience and luck matter more than skill. Tajiri put his childhood into that design, and it shows. Fact 9. The link cable was the game's physical heart, but it was also its greatest commercial gamble. Nintendo had shipped the Game Boy with a link cable port, but almost no games used it meaningfully. Tajiri saw that dormant port and understood something no one else at the time had fully articulated, that the social act of trading with a friend was itself a form of play. You were not just exchanging data, you were having a conversation, a negotiation, a moment of trust. The entire economy of the early Pokémon playground, the whisper networks about rare Pokémon, the deals struck at lunch tables, the arguments about fair trades, all of that emerged from a hardware feature most game developers had ignored. What Tajiri grasped was that a game could create a social context that existed outside the game itself. Pokémon didn't just give you things to do while sitting alone on a bus. It gave you things to talk about with the person sitting next to you. It created shared vocabulary, shared knowledge, shared obsession. The specific creatures you chose to trade became a form of communication about who you were, what you valued, whether you could be trusted. Games before Pokémon had offered competition. Pokémon offered something more complex: interdependence. Fact 10. Nintendo almost canceled Pokémon outright after seeing the early demo. According to multiple accounts, internal reactions at Nintendo were lukewarm at best. The concept seemed too complicated, too slow, too reliant on social interaction in an era when games were expected to be immediately gratifying. It was Shigeru Miyamoto, the designer of Mario and Zelda, who reportedly argued in favor of continuing to fund the project. His instinct that there was something genuinely interesting buried inside the concept kept it alive long enough to reach players. What Miyamoto reportedly saw was the trading mechanic itself. The idea that two children would be drawn together by the game, would need each other to complete what they had started, struck him as unlike anything the industry had tried before. Most games up to that point created either competition or cooperation. Pokémon created something more subtle and harder to name: mutual dependency. You needed what your friend had. Your friend needed what you had. Neither of you could finish alone. That specific dynamic, rare in any era of game design, was the heart Miyamoto recognized. There is something else worth understanding about those early years at Game Freak, which is the context in which these decisions were being made. The studio was tiny. At peak moments, the team was fewer than 10 people building something from scratch with technology that was already being called outdated. Tajiri was directing, but also involved in detailed design decisions and testing. Ken Sugimori was designing creatures while simultaneously handling graphic work for the interface. Junichi Masuda was composing music while also writing code. The entire game that would eventually transform popular culture was being built in conditions that a modern game studio would describe as barely functional. The miracle is not just that Pokémon succeeded. The miracle is that it was ever finished. The February 27, 1996's release of Pokémon Red and Green in Japan is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential days in entertainment history. Nothing about that day looked like that. It was a cold Tuesday in Tokyo. 2 Game Boy games shipped. They were about collecting monsters. The industry was not watching closely. Nobody was prepared for what would happen next. And the people who made it, the boy who used to catch insects, the illustrator who designed creatures under time pressure, the programmer who hid a secret in 300 bytes because he thought it would be funny, almost certainly did not know either. Drop a comment below right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing those roll in from everywhere. And if you are new here, please subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it means these videos keep coming. Section 2. Generation 1's Hidden Machinery. Pokemon Red and Blue, as most people know them, are cheerful little adventures about a 10-year-old with a dream and an overpowered rodent. They are simple on the surface, but underneath that surface, threaded through the code like a second skeleton, there are mechanical systems so strange and counterintuitive that even the players who spent hundreds of hours with these games never knew they existed. The interesting thing about Generation 1's hidden depths is not just that they existed, but that they were created partly by accident, partly by time pressure, and partly by the sheer ambition of a small team trying to build something more complex than they had the resources to fully test. The gaps between intention and execution in that first game produced some of the most beloved and most studied code anomalies in video game history. The players who dug into them were not just finding Easter eggs. They were doing something closer to archaeology, uncovering the evidence of decisions made under pressure by people who never expected anyone to look this closely. There is also this. Generation 1's hidden mechanics are interesting because they are not all errors. Some of them were intentional, buried below the surface and never advertised. The depth of the IV system, the way stat experience shaped Pokemon over time, the moment where your character's name becomes a Pokemon encounter, these are not the fingerprints of a team that didn't care about what it was building. They are the fingerprints of a team that cared so much it packed more into the game than it had time to explain. What players found when they looked closely was not shoddiness, it was density. Fact 11. The original stat system in Generation 1 did not use individual values and effort values the way modern games do. Instead, it used determinant values, DVs, and stat experience. DVs worked on a scale of 0 to 15 rather than 0 to 31. And here is the part that almost nobody knows. A Pokemon's gender in Generation 1 was not stored as a separate biological flag. It was derived directly from the attack D5. Any Pokemon with an attack DV of 0, 1, 2, or 3 was automatically female. Any Pokemon with an attack DV of 4 or higher was male. This meant that female Pokemon in Generation 1 structurally had lower attack stats than their male counterparts, by design, because those lower DV values had to produce the female result. Female Dragonite had a weaker attack ceiling than male Dragonite. It was baked into the biology of the system. This also meant something else. Shiny Pokemon in Generation 1 technically could not be female for most species, because shininess in Generation 1 was determined by having perfect DV values of 10 across the board, except for the HPDV. Those specific DV combinations produced male Pokemon by the gender derivation formula. A shiny female Pokemon in Generation 1 was genuinely impossible for most of the roster. It was not a rarity. It simply could not happen. Fact 12. Stat experience in Generation 1 was completely invisible to the player, accumulated passively, and had staggering effects on a Pokemon's final stats. Every time your Pokemon defeated an enemy Pokemon in battle, it gained stat experience equal to the base stats of the defeated creature across all 6 categories. These values built up over time and contributed meaningfully to how strong your Pokemon would become. A player who had battled hundreds of Caterpie and Weedle would end up with slightly stronger Pokemon than a player who avoided early game encounters entirely because different enemies distributed different profiles of stat experience across different stat categories. Most players had no idea this was happening. They were inadvertently fine-tuning their teams through casual grinding, building hidden depth into creatures that looked identical on the surface. The maximum stat experience for any given stat was 63,535. That number, at maximum, could add more than 60 additional points to a stat after level-based calculation. In a game where the difference between 20 points in speed might determine who attacks first and who gets knocked out before they can respond, This hidden system had real, meaningful competitive impact, and almost no one in 1996 understood it or knew how to use it deliberately. The competitive meta of Generation 1 was being shaped by a system its players did not know existed. They were optimizing without knowing what they were optimizing. Their hours of grinding had meaning they could not see. Fact 13. Focus energy in Generation 1 was broken in the opposite direction from its description. The move's tooltip states that it raises the critical hit rate of the user. In practice, due to a coding error, it did the exact opposite. Using focus energy reduced the user's critical hit chance rather than raising it. The move was actively harmful. Players who used focus energy were putting their Pokémon at a disadvantage without knowing it. This bug exists in every English and Japanese version of Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow, and was not corrected until Generation 2. For the players who were experimenting with movesets in that era, this must have produced deeply confusing results. They would use focus energy, feel like their Pokémon was landing fewer critical hits, and assume it was bad luck. They were right that something was wrong. They just had no way of knowing the game itself was the source of the problem, and this was not an obscure or rarely used move. Focus energy sounded appealing. Raise your crit rate before a big hit, build tension, strike at the right moment. The mechanic was conceptually sound. The execution was simply inverted. Entire strategies were built around a move that was doing the opposite of what everyone thought. This is the kind of error that is impossible to detect through play alone because the experience of a lower crit rate is indistinguishable, in the short run, from ordinary bad luck. The game was lying to its players, and the players had no way to know. Fact 14. There is a hidden type that appears in the internal data of Pokémon Red and Blue called Bird type. It has its own entry in the game's type chart system, with its own numerical identifier. No Pokémon in the final game uses Bird type. The creatures that were expected to be Bird type, like the early game bird Pokémon Pidgey and Spearow, were ultimately categorized as normal/flying instead. The Bird type entry in the code is just sitting there, a placeholder for a category that almost existed. The prevailing theory is that it would have functioned as a distinct counterpart to the flying type, possibly more grounded in actual bird behavior rather than the aerial acrobatics that flying type came to represent. The shadow of bird type is visible in one other place. The Pokédex descriptions for early bird Pokémon often describe them in ways that feel slightly mismatched with the flying typing they were ultimately given. Pidgey's entry talks about its ground-level habits and preference for low undergrowth. Spearow's describes it as an aggressive feeder that hunts near the earth. These descriptions read like creatures that were supposed to be categorized as a distinct bird category, grounded in the physical behavior of real birds rather than the broad aerial-themed category they ended up in. Bird type's ghost haunts the early Kanto Pokédex in small, quiet ways. Fact 15. Pikachu in the original Red and Blue has a data type listed in the internal code that marks it as both electric and, at some point in development, something that resembles the same bird type placeholder. Whether this was an actual design intention or a data error that crept in during testing has never been confirmed. But the trace is there, inside the cartridge, suggesting that at some point someone at Game Freak considered the possibility of a very different Pikachu. This detail is stranger when you sit with it. Pikachu is a mouse. It is described as a mouse throughout the Pokédex, which calls it the mouse Pokémon, and yet someone, at some point during development, attached a bird-type identifier to it in the code. Whether this was a meaningful design note or an accidental data carryover from another creature is lost to time, but the idea of a bird-type Pikachu, a creature that combined the electric mouse concept with some quality of bird behavior, sits in the code of every original cartridge like a small, baffling mystery that no amount of examination has fully resolved. Fact 16. The Old Man glitch, the technical mechanism that lets players encounter Mew in the wild in Pokémon Red and Blue, works because the game temporarily overwrites your character's name in memory when the Old Man's catching tutorial plays. To show the Old Man throwing a Pokeball at a Weedle, the game needs a name to display for the Pokemon involved, and it borrows memory from where your character's name is stored. When you then fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern coast, the game uses a piece of that same memory segment to determine which wild Pokemon to generate. Your character's name, now sitting in the wrong memory address, gets read as Pokemon encounter data. If your name happens to map to the internal value for Mew, if you named your character with specific characters in specific positions, the game will generate a Mew encounter. This is not a rumor. It is not a myth from the playground. It is a fully documented, reproducible exploit that works through a precise interaction of memory, addressing, and the game's flawed name storage process. The children of the 1990s who swapped stories about finding Mew and Bold were, many of them, accidentally stumbling onto the edges of something real. The specific steps were garbled in the retelling, but the core fact was true. You could find Mew. The game just never told you how. There is something quietly remarkable about the Mew glitch that tends to get lost in discussions of how it technically works. Shigeki Morimoto had hidden Mew in the game with 300 bytes of spare data 3 weeks before the game shipped as a personal project. He never expected players to find it, and yet the community's collective desire for a hidden Pokemon, their insistence that something extraordinary must be hiding somewhere in the game, led them to find a path to exactly the creature that was secretly there. The children who believed there was a Mew were right. They just had the method wrong. Fact 17. Glitch City in Pokemon Red and Blue is not a separate map. It is not a hidden area the developers designed and buried. Glitch City is what happens when the game's normal map logic breaks down entirely. It occurs when a player exploits the Safari Zone's step counter by saving inside the zone, resetting, and then walking out before the counter expires. The game gets confused about which map it should be displaying. When the player exits, the game loads graphical tile D from wherever the memory pointer happens to be pointing, which could be anything. The result is a landscape assembled from fragments of other maps, impossible geometries, impassable walls in the middle of roads, familiar tiles rearranged into meaningless patterns. Players who found Glitch City in the late 1990s described it like stepping into a dream version of Pallet Town. You recognize the pieces, a corner of a building, a strip of grass, a water tile, but nothing connected the way it should. The music continued. The game did not crash. You could walk around in the fragments for as long as your step counter allowed. It was the uncanny valley of video game geography. Fact 18. There is an invisible PC in a house in Celadon City in Pokemon Red and Blue. If you press the A button on a specific tile in a building where no PC is visible, the game responds as though you have interacted with one. This happened because early in development, map data was frequently copied between locations as a starting point, and the developers sometimes forgot to scrub interaction scripts tied to furniture that no longer existed in the copied map. The PC interaction script stayed attached to that tile even after the visual PC was removed. Players who stumbled onto it in the late 1990s had no idea this was a leftover from sloppy copy-paste map editing. They assumed it was a secret. Rumors flourished about hidden Pokemon you could access through the invisible PC if you found the right combination of inputs. Fact 19. The Lavender Town music has been the subject of one of the most persistent urban legends in gaming history. The creepypasta, which spread through internet forums in the mid-2000s, claimed that the original Japanese version of the Lavender Town theme contained high-frequency tones that caused headaches, anxiety, and in extreme cases, behavioral disturbances in children. The story expanded over time to include claims of hospitalizations and worse. None of it was true. The Lavender Town Syndrome, as it came to be called, was a piece of collaborative fiction that took root partly because the original Japanese soundtrack did genuinely differ from the international release. It was higher pitched and more abrasive before being softened, and partly because Lavender Town's subject matter, a town built on a haunted Pokemon graveyard, was already unsettling enough to prime people's imaginations. The music was adjusted between the Japanese and international releases for the same reason many Game Boy audio elements were adjusted. The tiny speaker handled certain frequencies better than others, and the localization team made audio engineering decisions to improve the listening experience. There was no conspiracy, there were no casualties, but the myth has outlasted every debunking because it feels true in the way that good ghost stories always do. The Lavender Town theme is genuinely one of the more atmospherically effective pieces of music in the franchise. Minor key, slow, specifically designed to feel haunted, and that quality of genuine unease created fertile ground for the creepypasta to plant itself. Fact 20. The truck near the SS Ironing in Vermilion City, famously rumored to hide a lure ball or a sleeping Mew beneath it, is one of the most iconic red herrings in gaming history. The truck is real. It exists in the game. You cannot interact with it. There is nothing underneath it. It was almost certainly placed there to add environmental detail to the port scene, a visual dressing meant to make the dock look like a working harbor. Somehow, the mere presence of an immovable object near a place where players knew something important had happened was enough to spark 2 decades of rumors. Some players claimed you needed strength to push it. Some claimed cut would reveal a path underneath. None of it was true. But Game Freak, years later in Pokémon Sun and Moon, placed a similar truck near the ferry dock in Hau'oli City as a direct wink at the legend. The truck serves no purpose. It is there entirely for the players who remember. Section 3. The Dark Lore, Hiding in the Pokédex. Most people read Pokédex entries as flavor text, a little description to add color to the creature you just caught. Sometimes charming, sometimes vague, occasionally odd. But if you read them carefully, if you sit with the words a little longer than the game expects you to, some of them become genuinely unsettling. Game Freak has been writing deeply strange things into these entries for 30 years, and most players have scrolled past without fully registering what they said. The Pokédex, as a concept in the game world, is an encyclopedia maintained by young trainers making observational notes about creatures they encounter. But the entries often read less like field observations and more like folklore, warning labels, and quietly told horror stories. Some entries describe behaviors that would, in any real-world context, make the described creature extremely dangerous to be near. Some describe creatures that are directly implied to kill or abduct humans. And some describe existential conditions, forms of existence that sound more like damnation than biology. The games present all of this with total calm. The Pokédex entry plays, the cry sounds, you press A and move on. The darkness sits where you left it. Fact 21. Yamask carries a mask that used to be its own face. The Pokédex entry in Pokémon Black states plainly, each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. Pokémon Black and White, released in 2010, were not the first games to suggest that some ghost-type Pokémon were once human. Gengar had that subtext for years. But Yamask was the first to state it with no ambiguity whatsoever. This creature was a person. It died. Its face became an artifact. And now it walks through the world carrying that face in its hands, occasionally looking at it and mourning who it used to be. What makes this worse is the evolution. When Yamask evolves into Cofagrigus, the Pokédex entries stop mentioning the human memories. Cofagrigus is described as a golden coffin Pokémon that pulls treasure hunters inside itself and transforms them into mummies. The implication is that whatever humanity survived in Yamask is erased by evolution. The grieving ends not through healing, but through loss of the capacity to remember what was lost. Fact 22. Gengar is, in one of Pokémon's longest-standing background theories, the ghost of the same species as Clefairy. The two creatures share a near-identical body silhouette. Clefairy is round, stubby, pale pink, associated with the moon and innocence. Gengar is round, stubby, purple-gray, associated with darkness and death. Multiple fan analyses and even some developer commentary have hinted at this connection. The idea being that a Clefairy who dies under violent or traumatic circumstances becomes a Gengar. The visual similarity is hard to dismiss as coincidence, especially given that Game Freak's designers have confirmed they were thinking about this kind of thematic pairing during the original design phase. What the Pokédex says about Gengar across various generations is deeply uncomfortable. It hides in shadows. It mimics your shadow. When you feel a sudden chill in an otherwise warm room, a Gengar is close. It seeks to make others share its condition. One entry notes that it lurks inside darkness and waits for the moment when a living person's body temperature drops to match its own. It is not described as malicious in the petty sense. It is described as lonely. If the Clefairy to Gengar theory is accurate, this loneliness has a specific origin. Gengar is not just a ghost. It is a Clefairy-shaped ghost, wandering near the moonlit meadows where it lived, trying to reach the creatures it used to live among. The chill you feel is not menace, it is loss. That reading transforms Gengar from a spooky opponent into something far more affecting, a creature that cannot stop returning to what it was before it became what it is. Game Freak has never confirmed the theory, but they have never denied it either. Fact 23. Drifloon is described in Pokémon Diamond as a Pokémon that grabs the hands of small children and tries to carry them away. The newer Pokédex entries have softened this slightly, describing Drifloon as confusing children who mistake it for a balloon. But the original framing was direct. This Pokemon lures children with its appearance and attempts to abduct them. The only saving grace offered by multiple entries is that Drifloon is light and tends to be too weak to actually lift most children. It fails at the act it intends, but the intent is there. A floating ghost designed to look like a toy, hovering in the places where children gather, reaching out. The game that contains Drifloon, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, is rated E for everyone. The creature is cheerful looking. Children pick it as a favorite, and its Pokédex description is about child abduction. This specific dissonance, a cute design wrapped around a genuinely disturbing function, is one of Game Freak's most common creative patterns, and it is deployed here with particular precision. Fact 24. Parasect is, by most readings, not alive in any meaningful sense. The mushroom growing on its back, the Paras mushroom that the pre-evolution carries as a relatively normal creature, has by the time of full evolution completely colonized the host body. Parasect's eyes are blank white, with no pupils, unlike every other Pokemon in the game. The Pokédex entries note that the mushroom controls the body. Parasect does not walk because it chooses to. It walks because the fungus directs it. What you are training when you level up a Parasect is not a Pokemon. It is a mobile spore delivery system using a dead body as a vehicle. The fact that this appears in the game starting from Generation 1, as a perfectly normal Pokemon you can catch in Mount Moon, suggests that Game Freak's designers were working with a much darker imagination than the cheerful exterior of the games implied. There is a real-world biological parallel here that the designers were clearly drawing on. The Ophiocordyceps fungus, which infects ants, takes control of their muscles and directs them to climb to a specific height before the fruiting body bursts from the host's head. Parasect is exactly this phenomenon translated into the world of a children's game, rendered in bright colors and handed to players to use in competitive battles. The science is accurate. The horror is intact. Fact 25. Kadabra's Pokédex entries contain one of the most quietly horrifying background theories in the franchise. Multiple entries across multiple generations reference a story. A young boy with psychic abilities went to sleep one night and woke up as a Kadabra. The entries hedge slightly, using language like, "it is rumored," or "some believe," but the story recurs consistently enough across multiple games that it reads less like a fan theory and more like something the writers are building into the lore. The implication that Kadabra, and by extension Alakazam, might be transformed humans, unwilling or unable to return to their original form, casts every battle involving these Pokemon in a quietly terrible new light. Kadabra's Pokédex history became more complicated in the early 2000s when illusionist Uri Geller sued Nintendo, claiming that the Japanese name Jungerer was based on his name without permission, and that the character's design, a spoon-bending psychic with a star symbol, was a deliberate caricature of him. Legal disputes continued for years and were ultimately settled, and Geller later publicly gave Nintendo permission to use the character again. For a stretch of nearly 20 years, Kadabra was notably absent from the Pokemon trading card game. No new Kadabra card was printed between 2003 and 2021 due to the litigation. The settled dispute eventually resulted in Kadabra's return to the card game, a psychic creature with a disputed human past, absent from a portion of the franchise's own history due to real-world legal action. Even the Pokemon's off-screen story is strange. Fact 26. Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother. This is well known enough that it almost does not qualify as obscure, but here is what most people do not know. Early concept art for Cubone from the original design phase showed multiple skull variants, as though different Cubone had skulls of different shapes representing different kinds of mothers. Game Freak considered, and then quietly abandoned, the idea that each individual Cubone carried a unique reminder of a specific loss. Instead of one universal tragedy, there would have been 1,000 different ones, each Cubone's grief inscribed in the specific shape of the thing it wore. Fact 27. Drowsy's design and lore are drawn from a Japanese mythological creature called the Baku, a tapir-like entity that is said to consume dreams. In traditional Japanese folklore, the Baku was considered protective, called upon to eat nightmares before they could cause harm. Game Freak took that concept and tilted it into something much more predatory. Drowsy specifically prefers children's dreams, which it characterizes as sweeter and more nourishing than adult dreams. Multiple Pokédex entries note that If your nose itches while you sleep, a drowsy might be standing over your pillow, feeding. The Baku of folklore was benign. Drowsy is something else. Fact 28. Mimikyu, the ghost/fairy Pokemon introduced in Generation 7, wears a Pikachu costume to disguise its true form. This is its defining characteristic. But what most players do not fully absorb is what the Pokédex says about what happens if the disguise is removed. The entries state that anyone who sees Mimikyu's true body becomes severely ill and sometimes dies. One entry from Pokemon Sun describes a researcher who pulled back the disguise to study the creature beneath and fell so gravely sick that they were hospitalized for 7 days, during which they could not stop shaking and could barely remember anything from those hours. They never completed their research. The true form of Mimikyu has never been canonically depicted in the games. It lives underneath its costume, and the game suggests that its exposure is catastrophic to human health. The sadness layered over this horror is worth sitting with. Mimikyu wears a Pikachu costume because Pikachu is loved, and Mimikyu wants to be loved. It chose the shape of the most beloved creature in the world and covered itself in it, hoping that someone would see the familiar outline and not flinch. Every Mimikyu you encounter in the game is a lonely thing wearing a mask, trying to be accepted. That the mask also hides something that kills makes the longing underneath it more painful, not less. Fact 29. Froslass, the Ice/Ghost. Pokemon from Generation 4 is said in its Pokédex entries to freeze its prey to temperatures around -58 degrees Fahrenheit and then display them in its lair. The entries describe these frozen figures as a collection. They note that among the frozen things displayed in its cave, hikers and climbers are sometimes found. Froslass has missing persons cases associated with it, described plainly and without drama in the same tone of a field guide entry about a bird's habitat. Humans go into the mountains and do not come back, and when you read the Pokédex carefully, you understand where they went. Fact 30. The Pokédex entry for Chandelure in Pokemon Black describes it absorbing the spirits of creatures it burns. The soul wanders, the entry says, lost and unable to move on. Chandelure is a haunted chandelier made of purple fire that steals your soul, burns it, and leaves the empty husk of whatever you were to wander the world forever. It is also very effective against ice-type opponents and has a base special attack stat of 145, which makes it excellent in competitive play. These two realities exist simultaneously in the same game, and children choose Chandelure as their favorite Pokemon every day. What unifies all of these entries, Yamask, Parasect, Drifloon, Chandelure, and the dozens of others scattered throughout the franchise, is that Game Freak never draws attention to them. There is no warning label, no asterisk directing you to parental guidance. The game presents the skull of your mother and the theft of your soul with the same visual tone it uses for an entry about a Pokemon that smells like flowers. This creative decision, to place darkness in plain sight without flinching, is one of the bravest and strangest things about a franchise that the world has mostly decided is a children's property. There are children who grew up reading these entries and felt, for the first time, that a piece of media was treating them seriously, that it was not sanitizing the world into something purely safe, that it was acknowledging, in the quiet space between a cry sound and the press of a button, that some things are sad, and some things are frightening, and some things do not resolve neatly. The Pokédex was not written to disturb, but it was written with the understanding that disturbing things exist, and that children, encountering them in the frame of a game they love, might be better prepared to understand them. Section 4. The Things That Almost Existed. Scrapped content. In 2018, something genuinely remarkable happened in the Pokemon fandom. Collectors and researchers obtained a copy of the Space World 1997 demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver, a playable prototype shown at a Nintendo trade show in Japan a full year before Pokemon Red and Blue even reached North American shelves. When data miners cracked it open, what they found was extraordinary, an entirely different version of the second generation of Pokemon. The Space World demo leak was not just interesting for what it contained. It was a window into a creative process that is normally invisible. Game development usually hides its own history. Games are shipped, and the versions that almost existed disappear. Source code gets archived or deleted. Design documents get lost. But here, preserved in a ROM file, was a snapshot of a game in mid-thought, a Pokémon game that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. The creatures in it were not refined. The systems were not final. It was Pokémon thinking out loud, and getting to see it was like finding a diary that had been sealed for 20 years. Fact 31. The Space World 1997 demo contained approximately 200 Pokémon designs, many of which never appeared in the final games. There were baby forms for Pokémon that currently have no pre-evolution: Baby Growlithe, Baby Meowth, Baby Vulpix, Baby Doduo, Baby Tangela. There was a baby version of Mr. Mime with a completely different design from Mime Jr., which eventually appeared in Generation 4. These baby Pokémon were apparently planned to expand the accessibility of breeding mechanics, which were being developed for Gold and Silver. When the game was pushed back and redesigned, most of these baby forms were quietly cut. The designs themselves, when fans finally saw them in 2018, prompted an extraordinary response. Communities rebuilt the sprites in high resolution. Fan artists designed evolved forms for the baby Pokémon that were never intended. Several prominent Pokémon content creators produced hours of video content, speculating about how the franchise would have differed had these creatures been included. A baby Ninetales, a baby Meowth, a baby Farfetch'd. These things existed, briefly, as someone's creative vision, and then stopped existing, and then existed again 20 years later in a leaked file that the internet would never forget. Fact 32. The original Fire-type starter for Pokémon Gold and Silver in the Space World demo was not Cyndaquil. It was a different creature entirely, a small bear-like Pokémon with a flame motif. When Game Freak redesigned the starter lineup closer to the game's final release, this Fire starter was scrapped. The design did not disappear entirely, however. The body structure and general aesthetic of that scrapped Fire starter appears to have been repurposed and softened into Teddiursa, the normal-type bear Pokémon that appears in the final version of Gold and Silver. If this is accurate, and the visual resemblance in the leaked sprites supports it strongly, then Teddiursa was originally supposed to be your partner from the beginning of your journey through Johto. Fact 33. Girafarig, the giraffe Pokémon in Generation 2, with the distinctive second face on its tail, had a completely different design in the Space World demo. It was depicted as a two-headed giraffe, symmetrical and mirrored, with a full head at each end of its body. The current design, where the second face is smaller and located on the tail, is a significant reduction from what was originally planned. Many fans have pointed out that Girafarig's name reads the same backwards as forwards, a palindrome, which only makes full sense if both ends of the creature were equally significant, as the original two-headed design suggested. This detail matters because it reveals how Game Freak sometimes buries the history of a design decision in the name of the Pokémon that survived. The palindrome name is a monument to the symmetrical design that was cut. If you know to look, the name tells you what the creature used to be. Girafarig carries the ghost of its original design in the spelling of its own name. Fact 34. The scrapped evolution data in the Space World demo included evolutions for Pokémon that still lack them today. Data miners found placeholder sprites and type data for evolutions of Yanma, Girafarig, Shuckle, and Piloswine. Yanmega, the evolution of Yanma, eventually appeared in Generation 4. Mamoswine, the evolution of Piloswine, also came in Generation 4. But Girafarig and Shuckle have still never received evolutions as of today, meaning those designs from the 1997 demo remain the only glimpse of what Game Freak once considered. The fact that they planned it at all, coded placeholders for it, and then held it back for decades is a mystery the Pokémon community has never stopped discussing. Fact 35. In the original beta designs for Pokémon Red and Blue, Coughing and Wheezing had completely different names. Early concept materials show them labeled as NY and LA, as in New York and Los Angeles. The idea was apparently that these poison cloud Pokémon represented the air pollution of major industrial American cities. When the games were localized, the American name Coughing and Wheezing were substituted, and the direct city references were dropped. But the original concept reveals that Game Freak was thinking about environmental themes from the very beginning of the franchise. The environmental commentary embedded in this design is more pointed than it might seem. Two Pokémon representing smog clouds named after American cities, placed in a game about preserving the natural world and forming bonds with creatures. There was something deliberate being said about industrialization and its cost to the environment. That commentary became softer once the names changed, but the design itself retained the shape of the original criticism. Coughing and wheezing look exactly like the exhaust clouds billowing from a manufacturing city's smokestacks. Fact 36. There is evidence in the code of Pokémon Red and Blue that the original plan included 3-stage evolution lines for many Pokémon that only have 2. A Nintendo Power interview from July 2000 with members of the development team confirmed that most 2-stage Pokémon were originally intended to be 3-stage. You can see traces of this in the existing roster. There are scrapped design sketches for pre-evolutions of Zubat, Vulpix, Meowth, Psyduck, Goldeen, Pikachu, Cubone, and Ponyta. Pikachu almost had a pre-evolution before Pichu existed. The franchise we know is considerably more compressed than what was originally imagined. Fact 37. Pokémon Gold and Silver were originally titled Pocket Monsters 2. Gold and Silver and the number 2 appeared in early promotional materials. The sequel framing was eventually dropped, and the games were simply rebranded as Pocket Monsters Gold and Silver, likely to avoid making them feel inaccessible to new players. The player character's hometown in the beta was called Silent Hills, a name that has since taken on entirely different associations in gaming history, though the Pokémon use predates any of that. Fact 38. In the Space World 1997 demo, the player had the option to name their mother, just as they could name themselves and their rival. This feature was removed from the final games, where your mother is simply your mother, unnamed and unchangeable. Whether this was a game design decision, or a localization simplification, or something else entirely is not clearly documented. But for a brief period in Pokémon's development, your mom had a name you chose for her. This small detail opens a window into how differently the game conceived of its personal relationships in its earliest form. A named mother is a specific person with a specific relationship to a specific player. An unnamed mother is universal, generic, anyone's mother. The removal of her name was possibly a decision about making the protagonist feel more broadly relatable, more every child than any specific child. But something was lost in that universality. The version of the game where you could name your mom had a slightly more personal heart. Fact 39. Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire contain unused cries in the game's code that do not match any known Pokémon. These are not corrupted audio files. They are clean, distinct cries that sound like they belong to specific creatures, with the same kind of tonal signature that legitimate Pokémon cries have. Researchers believe these were placeholder sounds for legendary Pokémon designs that were tested and then replaced with entirely different designs before the final game shipped. The cries hint at Pokémon we never saw, creatures that existed in the development of Hoenn and then vanished, leaving only sound behind. Fact 40. The Trick House in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, the quirky optional dungeon run by a puzzle-obsessed host, was originally designed as a much larger facility. Development documents suggest it was meant to be a sprawling maze with multiple floors, unlocking new layers as the player progressed, filled with trainers and hidden paths. Space limitations on the Game Boy Advance compressed it into the smaller, simpler attraction in the final game. The Trickmaster in the final version hints at an ambition the hardware simply could not support. This pattern, ambitious concept followed by hardware-limited execution, followed by compressed release, is one of the defining rhythms of Pokémon's development history. Nearly every generation of games shows evidence of things imagined larger and released smaller. The history of the franchise is in some ways the history of what the hardware of each era could hold, and the constant straining against those limits by teams who wanted to give players more than the machines could carry. Section 5. The myths and playground legends that shaped a generation. Before the internet was ubiquitous, before you could pull out your phone and check Bulbapedia between classes, Pokémon information traveled the way rumors always travel, from mouth to mouth, from desk to desk, in the margins of notebooks and on folded sheets of loose-leaf paper passed across classrooms. Some of what spread was true, some of it was wrong but harmless, and some of it took on a life so far beyond anything the games actually contained that it became its own kind of folklore. The remarkable thing about Pokémon's playground mythology is not just that it existed, but that it has been studied since then as a genuine cultural phenomenon. Researchers who study how information spreads in pre-internet communities have used Pokemon rumors as examples because they are so well documented and so instructive. The Pokemon community of the late 1990s was a perfect laboratory for observing how stories mutate as they travel, how desire shapes what people believe, and how the absence of authoritative information creates space for invention. The games were complex enough that new secrets felt plausible. The franchise was popular enough that everyone wanted to be the one who knew more, and the internet was just barely beginning to offer verification. Fact 41. The Poke God phenomenon of the late 1990s was a mass hallucination of fakery. During the peak of Pokemon's first wave of popularity, between 1998 and 2001, players created and circulated fake magazine scans, counterfeit cheat codes, and fabricated strategy guides describing Pokemon that did not exist. Creatures with names like Pikablu, Charcolt, Peekaboo, and dozens of others were described in painstaking detail with specific locations, specific steps, specific in-game conditions required to encounter them. Some of these fakes were good enough that official gaming magazines, actual print publications with editorial staff, published them as genuine discoveries before corrections were issued. Children tried these steps faithfully for months. None of them worked. The Pokemon did not exist, but the desire for them to exist was so strong that the rumors refused to die. The sophistication of some of these fabrications is worth noting. They were not simply someone saying, "There's a secret Pokemon." They had Pokedex numbers. They had type matchups. They had backstories that plausibly fit within the logic of the game world. They were constructed with enough internal consistency that they passed casual scrutiny. The children and teenagers who invented them were, in a strange way, doing the same creative work that Game Freak was doing, building creatures that felt like they belonged in the Pokemon universe, just without the authority to put them in an actual game. Fact 42. Pikablu was the most famous of the Poke Gods and was, in reality, a reference to Marill, a real Pokemon that appeared briefly in a Pokemon movie preview shown before Mewtwo Strikes Back in 1998. Most American children had not yet seen Gold and Silver, which would not be released in North America until October 2000. They saw this small, round, blue creature on the screen during the preview and had no frame of reference for what it was. In the absence of official information, the rumor mill filled the gap. By the time Marill was officially revealed as a Generation 2 Pokemon, some children had spent 2 years trying Unlock Pikablu through combinations of button presses and save states that their friends swore worked. Fact 43. The Mew Under the Truck story persisted in part because there genuinely was something strange about that truck. It sat at the dock in Vermilion City, the area where the SS Anne was moored. The SS Anne left after a specific story event and could not be revisited after a certain point in the game. Players had this instinct, not entirely wrong, that the area near the dock contained something they might have missed. The truck became the focal point of that anxiety. A few players used GameShark codes to gain access to areas behind the dock after the ship had gone and found nothing meaningful, but the act of checking, of refusing to accept that a game might simply contain a decorative object, became its own kind of ritual. Fact 44. There was a widely circulated rumor in the early Pokemon era that completing the Pokedex, registering all 151 Pokemon, would unlock a special Pokemon obtainable from Professor Oak. This was partially true in spirit, but technically false. Completing the Pokedex did trigger a reaction from Oak, who acknowledged the achievement and gave the player a diploma. He did not give out a Pokemon, but the rumor that he would, that the ultimate reward for the most exhausting task in the game was a legendary creature no one had ever seen, was so compelling that it drove players to trade for Mew through cartridge owners who claimed to have gotten it from Nintendo events, some of which were real and many of which were fabricated. The completed Pokedex rumor is interesting because it is the most structurally logical of all the playground myths. Of course, finishing the Pokedex should give you something extraordinary. Of course, the professor who sent you on the quest should have a reward commensurate with its difficulty. The rumor was wrong about the specific reward, but it was right about the shape of a satisfying story. Players who expected something legendary from Oak were applying narrative logic to a game that simply hadn't taken its own premise that far. The diploma you actually received was the game's honest answer. The legendary creature was the answer the story deserved. Fact 45. Buried Alive was a piece of Pokemon creepypasta that became so embedded in the community's collective memory that many players genuinely could not separate it from actual game content. The story described a humanoid zombie-like figure that was supposedly a scrapped boss encounter at the top of Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, a final challenge that had been removed from the game before release, but whose data allegedly still existed in corrupted cartridges. There were fabricated screenshots, there were forum posts from people claiming to have encountered it. None of it was real. But the specific detail that it was removed content, that Game Freak had once planned something disturbing and then thought better of it, made it feel plausible to anyone who already knew that the developers had a track record of cutting things. Fact 46. The rumor that a specific move combination could force Charizard to evolve into a fourth stage, sometimes called Charcoal, sometimes Charizardwu, appeared in multiple independent playground networks with enough consistency that it seems to have been a genuine distributed rumor rather than a single source that spread. Children in different parts of the world, without contact with each other, invented the same evolution for the same Pokemon. This says something interesting about the psychology of Pokemon players. Charizard was so appealing, its power so viscerally satisfying, that the idea of it becoming even stronger was one that many minds arrived at independently. Fact 47. Multiple playground myths involve the concept of a secret Pokemon, accessible only through a very specific sequence of actions that required multiple playthroughs or the involvement of multiple friends. This structure, the idea that the most powerful things in the game required social coordination, community effort, shared knowledge, mirrors the actual design philosophy of Pokemon. Tajiri built the game around trading and connection. The myths that surrounded the game were built the same way. You needed someone else's information to get there. This mirroring is not accidental. The myths that survive in any community tend to reflect the values of the community that generates them. Pokemon was a game about collecting, connecting, and completing. The rumors it produced were about secret collectibles that required connection and effort to reach. The community's imagination was shaped by the game, even when the game itself had nothing to do with what they imagined. Fact 48. There is a confirmed reference to the truck rumor in Pokemon Sun and Moon. Near the port in Hau'oli City, a truck is parked. It does nothing. There is nothing beneath it. It is Game Freak's acknowledgement, it's 20 years after the fact, that they knew what players had been saying about their game. The truck in Sun and Moon is a joke, but it is a loving one. It is a monument to the collective imagination of an entire generation of children who wanted there to be something extraordinary hiding just beneath the surface of the world they loved. Fact 49. The rumors about the Cerulean Cave, that it contained secret Pokemon beyond Mewtwo, that specific tiles and specific rooms triggered encounters with creatures not in the Pokédex, were almost certainly fueled by the cave's genuinely strange design. Cerulean Cave is, mechanically, one of the most unusual locations in the original games. You cannot enter it until after you have become champion, which means it is the game's final exploration content. Its layout is confusing and non-linear. The Pokemon inside it are significantly higher level than almost anything else in the game. The presence of Mewtwo at the deepest point, waiting without fanfare in an empty room, is itself so uncanny that players instinctively felt there must be more. There was not, but the cave was designed to feel like there should be. Fact 50. One of the strangest playground myths of the era involved a claimed encounter with an all-black Pokemon that appeared when your cartridge battery was dying. Players with old or damaged cartridges would sometimes experience graphical glitches, color shifts, or unusual behavior near areas where save data was corrupted. Some of these players interpreted the corrupted sprites as a hidden Pokemon. The story grew from there. The black Pokemon never had a consistent name or location. It was simply darkness taking a shape, and children read that shape as intentional. What is fascinating about this rumor, in retrospect, is how accurately it describes the phenomenology of encountering actual glitch Pokemon in the original games. Missing No and its relatives do sometimes appear as distorted, visually corrupted entities. The corrupted graphics of a failing cartridge do genuinely resemble the scrambled sprites of a glitch encounter. The rumor was wrong about what was causing the phenomenon, but it was not entirely wrong about the phenomenon itself. Section 6. Banned episodes and censored stories. The Pokemon anime has produced well over 1,000 episodes across its run. That is a remarkable volume of television by any measure, and the sheer scale of the production means that errors, misjudgments, and culturally specific content were always going to create friction somewhere in the global distribution chain. What is more surprising is how many of the decisions about what to cut, change, or ban have created fascinating gaps and anomalies that casual viewers never noticed, but dedicated fans have spent years cataloging. The history of Pokémon censorship is also a history of the clash between different cultural contexts and different assumptions about what children can handle. What reads as entertaining adventure in one market reads as inappropriate content in another. What is a standard visual element in Japanese animation becomes a problem requiring editing in an American broadcast context. And what a broadcaster in one country decides to cut for cultural reasons creates continuity gaps that ripple through a series for years afterward. The Pokémon anime's censorship history is a detailed case study in what happens when a piece of media designed for one cultural moment gets distributed around the world. Fact 51. The most infamous banned episode in all of anime, not just Pokémon, is episode 38 of the original series, titled Den-o Senshi Porygon in Japanese. It aired once on TV Tokyo on December 16, 1997, and was never broadcast again anywhere in the world. The episode featured a sequence of rapidly alternating red and blue frames that were intended to look like an explosion or a blast effect inside a digital world. The flashing lasted approximately 4 seconds. Approximately 685 Japanese children experienced seizure-like symptoms, nausea, and eye pain. Around 150 were hospitalized. The episode triggered a 4-month hiatus for the entire Pokémon anime and prompted the Japanese Broadcasting Authority to issue new guidelines about flashing lights in animation that affected the entire industry. The production response to this incident was sweeping and immediate. New protocols for animation safety testing were implemented across the Japanese animation industry. Broadcasts were delayed. Reruns of the show were subjected to new review processes. The Pokémon anime's entire creative team had to reckon with the fact that something they had produced had sent children to hospitals. That reckoning shaped the production culture of the show for years afterward. Here is the part that is genuinely unfair, and which almost every Pokémon fan knows but bears repeating. The flashing lights in that scene were produced by Pikachu's electric attack, not by Porygon. Pikachu caused the incident. Porygon was the protagonist of that specific episode, a creature that had done nothing wrong and caused no harm. But Porygon, and its evolutions, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, have never appeared in a meaningful animated role since that night in 1997. They have been essentially invisible in the anime for nearly 30 years because of an animation accident that was not their fault. Porygon is, in a quiet way, the most unjustly treated creature in Pokémon's history. Fact 52. Episode 35, The Legend of Dratini, was banned internationally before it even aired outside Japan. The episode takes place in the Safari Zone and involves an old warden with a deep attachment to the legendary Dratini that lives in his territory. The reason for the ban is straightforward. The episode features an extended scene where characters point firearms directly at Ash and his companions. Not a cartoon gun, not a comedic pop gun, a real-looking pistol held at very close range by an adult character, pointed at a child protagonist. Western broadcasters reviewed the content and concluded that this was not appropriate for their morning programming blocks. The episode was never dubbed into English. What makes this particularly interesting from a continuity standpoint is that the episode also features something important. The Safari Zone warden owns a Dragonite. At the time, Dragonite was one of the most powerful and mysterious Pokémon in the franchise, essentially unknown to Western audiences. International viewers were denied the reveal entirely. To them, Dragonite remained a rumor, a creature described in guidebooks but never shown on screen, until considerably later in the anime's run. This is one of the clearest examples of how a censorship decision can create not just a gap in the story, but a gap in the mythology. A creature that was supposed to have a moment of reveal was denied that moment, and became more mysterious because of it, rather than less. Fact 53. The episode Beauty and the Beach was the first episode skipped in the initial English broadcast run, and the reason for the skip is more specific than most summaries suggest. The episode itself was eventually dubbed and aired in a limited capacity, but in a heavily edited form. The original Japanese version features James of Team Rocket, wearing an inflatable bodysuit designed to resemble a woman's body in a bikini, which he uses to enter a beachside beauty competition. He then taunts Misty about the difference in their figures. This was deemed unsuitable for American children's television in the late 1990s. The edited English version removed the James scenes, but retained a different element of the episode, an extended sequence involving cannon fire and an explosive battle. So, the version of the episode that eventually aired had excised the body image comedy but kept the military hardware destruction. This inversion, cutting the humor but keeping the violence, is one of the most frequently cited examples of the inconsistency in 4Kids Entertainment's approach to censorship. It raises a genuinely interesting question about what we communicate to children when we decide that a joke about bodies is more damaging than the sight of a cannon being fired at people. Fact 54. South Korea banned more than 20 Pokemon episodes during the show's initial run, and the reasons were politically and historically rooted in a way that had nothing to do with the content being inappropriate for children. The Korean government maintained restrictions on Japanese cultural exports during a period when the historical tensions between Japan and South Korea made the widespread consumption of Japanese media politically contentious. Episodes featuring samurai characters, traditional Japanese festival imagery, kimono clothing, or architecture resembling Japanese temples were prohibited. Episodes like Challenge of the Samurai, The Ghost of Maiden's Peak, and others were cut not because they were violent or suggestive, but because they were too visibly Japanese. This created unusual continuity gaps for Korean viewers, some of which involved episodes where Ash obtained gym badges. Korean fans watching the dubbed sequence found themselves missing plot-relevant information because the episodes in which those events occurred had simply not aired. Fact 55. An episode about Whiscash and Barboach using the move Earthquake was pulled from Japanese broadcast scheduling and has never aired anywhere in the world. The episode was scheduled to air on November 4, 2004. 6 days before its scheduled broadcast, the Chuetsu earthquake struck Niigata Prefecture in Japan, killing 67 people and injuring over 4,000 more. An episode centered on Pokemon shaking the earth was deemed inappropriate in the immediate aftermath of a real earthquake disaster and was quietly removed from the schedule. It has never been reinserted. It remains officially unaired, not banned for content but absent out of respect. Fact 56. A two-part story arc called Team Rocket vs. Team Plasma was produced for Pokemon Black and White, fully animated and completed. It was scheduled to air in March 2011. On March 11, 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami devastated the northeastern coast of Japan, killing nearly 20,000 people. The two-part episode depicted a city being attacked and buildings collapsing. It was immediately pulled from broadcast. Unlike the Whiscash episode, the Team Rocket vs. Team Plasma arc was eventually declared non-canonical. The events it depicted were quietly removed from the official continuity of the series. It exists as a completed piece of animation that will almost certainly never be released. The decision to make that arc non-canonical rather than simply delayed was significant because it created a genuine discontinuity in the story of Black and White's anime adaptation. The Team Plasma storyline, which should have been introduced early in the Unova arc, was instead handled in a truncated form much later in the series without the setup the completed episodes would have provided. The resulting narrative felt rushed in ways that would have been avoided had the original arc aired as intended. A natural disaster reshaped the structure of a Pokemon anime season. It is one of the stranger moments in the franchise's broadcast history. Fact 57. The Holiday High Jinx episode was initially only a temporary ban in the United States, pulled from the Kids WB rotation in 1999 after author Carol Boston Weatherford published an essay arguing that Jinx's original design, which featured black skin and exaggerated facial features, was a harmful caricature. The episode was later brought back in an edited form for some markets, but was eventually placed under a global broadcast restriction by the Pokemon Company International in 2013 and removed from home video and streaming releases worldwide. The same editing process was applied retroactively to older episodes where Jinx appeared, meaning that some fans own DVD releases of episodes that look distinctly different from how those episodes appeared when they originally aired. Jinx's skin color was changed to purple across all future media. Fact 58. The original Japanese Pokemon anime featured significantly more adult humor and cultural references than Western audiences ever saw. 4Kids Entertainment, the American localization company responsible for the first seasons of the dub, had a policy of editing content to bring it into compliance with their understanding of American children's television standards. Food was regularly renamed or visually altered. Rice balls became sandwiches, sake became juice. Certain scenes were removed entirely, and characters who in the Japanese version had distinct adult personalities and motivations were sometimes flattened into simpler archetypes by the dubbing process. Brock's romantic pursuit of women, which in the Japanese version had a more earnest emotional quality, was partially modified in the English dub. Some country-specific dubs went even further, replacing Brock entirely with a different character. Fact 59. Team Rocket's motto changes substantially by country. The English motto, "Prepare for trouble, make it double," is one of the most recognizable pieces of Pokemon dialogue in the Western world. The Japanese motto is a different poem entirely, more structured, with references to love and a kind of theatrical nobility. It references a white tomorrow and the pursuit of dreams. Some Latin American Spanish dubs wrote entirely original versions of the motto that incorporated local wordplay. The motto, which feels like a fixed part of the franchise's identity, is actually one of its most adaptable elements. The diversity of Team Rocket mottos across the world's dubbing traditions is, in its own small way, a testament to how universal the character archetypes are. Jessie, James, and Meowth translate across cultures not because the specific words of their motto carry over, but because the underlying dynamic does. The theatrical, incompetent villain, the comedic trio that fails every week and returns the following episode with identical optimism. That structure is legible everywhere. The words change. The rhythm stays the same. Fact 60. An episode involving a samurai trainer carrying a real sword alongside his Pokemon was scripted, storyboarded, and is referenced in production documents but never aired. The episode was pulled before broadcast due to concerns about weapon depictions. Only fragments of its existence have surfaced through leaks and interviews with production staff. The accumulation of pulled and banned episodes across the anime's history amounts to something like a shadow version of the show, a Pokemon anime that exists only in production records, in half-remembered accounts from staff interviews, in leaked storyboard images, and in the gaps that careful viewers noticed in the continuity of the broadcast series. That shadow version contains earthquakes and samurai and firearms and floods. It is a rougher, stranger version of the show we got, and the fact that it was produced at all, that these stories were written, drawn, animated, and then pulled before most viewers ever saw them, is a reminder that the Pokemon anime was always working with more darkness than it was ever permitted to show. Section 7. The real-world mythology underneath the creatures. Pokemon's creatures are not invented from nothing. They draw from a deep well of folklore, mythology, cultural history, and natural science. Some of these connections are obvious. Ninetales is a fox with 9 tails, drawn straight from Japanese kitsune legends. But others are layered in ways that require a little context to appreciate fully. And that context, once you have it, makes the Pokemon feel like something older and stranger than a game designer's sketch. The depth of the mythological research embedded in Pokemon design is sometimes surprising even to people who follow the series closely. Game Freak's designers have drawn from Chinese mythology, Japanese Shinto tradition, European folk belief, Scandinavian mythology, native traditions from multiple continents, and biological science in ways that reward close reading. Pokemon is not just a game about creatures. It is a world built on a substrate of human storytelling that stretches back centuries. The creatures carry that history in their names, their typings, their Pokédex entries, and their designs. What makes this mythological layer especially interesting is that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. A child playing the game for the first time encounters Ninetales as a fire-type fox Pokemon with high special attack and an elegant design. An adult who knows the Kitsune tradition encounters the same creature and reads something much richer, a millennium of Japanese folk belief about the relationship between foxes, fire, and the supernatural, encoded in a Game Boy sprite. The mythological depth is a reward for knowledge, but it doesn't require that knowledge to be enjoyed. The game works at both levels at once, and this layering is one of the things that has kept the franchise interesting to return to across decades and across age groups. Fact 61. Gyarados is, in the most direct sense, a retelling of the Chinese legend of the Dragon Gate. In the original myth, which appears in classical Chinese texts and has been referenced in Japanese literature for centuries, a koi fish in the Yellow River swims upstream against the current and attempts to leap over the Dragon Gate waterfall. The journey is enormously difficult. Most koi fail and are washed back downstream. The ones that succeed in leaping over the gate are transformed by the gods into dragons. The story is a parable about perseverance in the face of apparently hopeless odds. Magikarp is pathetically weak. Splash does nothing meaningful. And then, at level 20, it evolves into one of the most terrifying aquatic Pokémon in the game. The specific progression of that transformation, from useless to overwhelming, from laughed at to feared, is the Dragon Gate legend compressed into a game mechanic. The original Pokémon Snap took this connection a step further. In that game, players could trigger Magikarp's evolution into Gyarados by knocking it into a waterfall with a Pester Ball. The waterfall is the Dragon Gate. The leap through it is the transformation. It is mythology rendered as a video game action. One additional detail worth noting, Gyarados, despite having the obvious visual design of a dragon, is not a dragon-type Pokémon. It is water/flying. This has generated decades of competitive frustration and fan theorizing. The most compelling explanation is that the myth's dragon is specifically the result of the transformation. The dragon is earned, not inherent, and Gyarados' typing reflects that it has not yet claimed that full dragon identity. It became a sea serpent. The true dragon is a step beyond, which is part of why Mega Gyarados finally receives the dragon typing. The myth completes itself in the Mega form. Fact 62. Nine Tails draws from the Kitsune tradition of Japanese folklore, where supernatural foxes grow more powerful and more complex with age, acquiring additional tails as centuries pass. The most powerful Kitsune have 9 tails and are considered divine messengers or independent supernatural forces in their own right. The Kitsune can produce fire, foxfire, hitodama, the glowing balls of light associated with graveyards and foxes in Japanese tradition, which explain Ninetales' fire typing. Vulpix, the pre-evolution, has 6 tails. It has not yet reached the 9-tailed perfection of the Kitsune in full power. The evolution from Vulpix to Ninetales is the progression of a yokai through spiritual growth, rendered in a handheld game. Ninetales also has one of the more specific Pokédex entries in terms of cultural reference. It is said to live for 1,000 years, which aligns directly with the folklore claim that Kitsune of sufficient power have essentially infinite lifespans. One of its entries describes a person who grabbed the tail of a Ninetales and was cursed to live for 1,000 years of suffering as a consequence. The warning embedded in that entry is a direct echo of Kitsune folklore, where disrespecting a fox spirit brings terrible, lasting consequences. The game is not just inspired by Kitsune mythology, it is telling Kitsune mythology in a different voice. Fact 63. Drowsy is built on the Baku, a tapir-like creature from Japanese mythology that was called upon to consume nightmares before they could cause spiritual harm. In the folklore, a child who woke frightened from a bad dream could whisper, "Baku, devour my nightmare," and the creature would come and eat the bad dream away, leaving peaceful sleep behind. Game Freak took this fundamentally protective creature and made it predatory instead. Drowsy comes to sleeping people not to remove their nightmares, but to eat their dreams for nourishment. It prefers the sweeter, more vivid dreams of children. The Baku folklore provided the aesthetic and the ability. The Pokémon stripped out the benevolence and kept the hunger. Fact 64. The fairy type's weakness to steel and immunity to dragon are not arbitrary game design decisions. They are drawn from European folklore about fairy creatures. In Western tradition, particularly in British and Irish folk belief, iron is one of the most reliable defenses against supernatural beings. Cold iron wards off fairies, ghosts, and witches. The horseshoe over the door keeps evil out. This is why steel-type moves are particularly effective against fairy-type Pokémon. The immunity to dragon types comes from the same tradition. In European folklore, good magic, the magic of the folk world, the fairy realm, is in opposition to the dark magic of dragons. Fairy-type immunity to dragon is the encoded mythology of an entire continent's worth of folk belief about the war between different magical forces. The introduction of the fairy type in Generation 6 was significant not just for competitive balance, but for the signal it sent about the depth of Game Freak's design research. Type matchups in Pokémon are rarely purely mechanical. They are usually narratively grounded. Fire burns grass, water douses fire, electricity disrupts water. The fairy-steel relationship and the fairy-dragon immunity are grounded in something that predates the games by centuries. The specific folk belief of pre-Christian Europe that iron and the supernatural do not coexist. When you use Clefable to absorb a dragon-type attack in a competitive battle, you are drawing on a belief system that dates back to the Iron Age. Fact 65. Meowth is based on the Maneki Neko, the Japanese beckoning cat figurine seen in restaurants and shops across Japan and much of East Asia. The Maneki Neko raises one paw in a welcoming gesture, believed to bring good fortune and customers to a business. Meowth's design mirrors this directly. The raised paw, the coin on the forehead, the sleek urban quality. In the anime, Team Rocket's Meowth famously taught himself to speak human language in order to appeal to a Meowth he loved, who rejected him because he was not more like a Maneki Neko. The folklore origin and the anime backstory are the same story told from different angles, a cat trying to be worthy of the symbol that represents its kind. Fact 66. Jirachi is connected to the Tanabata Festival, the Japanese star festival celebrated on the 7th day of the 7th month. The festival involves writing wishes on strips of colored paper and hanging them from bamboo branches. According to legend, the two stars representing the celestial lovers Orihime and Hikoboshi, separated for most of the year by the Milky Way, are permitted to meet on this night. Jirachi is a wish Pokémon that wakes for 7 days, every 1,000 years, and grants wishes during that window. The design of its body includes paper-like tags with writing on them, direct visual references to the Tanabata wish papers. The connection between Jirachi and Tanabata is one of those mythological embeddings that works at every level. The visual design carries the reference. The mechanic, a creature that grants wishes but is only accessible for a limited window of time, carries the reference. And the emotional register of the mythology, which is fundamentally about longing, about being separated from what you love by forces you cannot control, and about cherishing the brief moments when reunion is possible, resonates with the tone of the Pokémon games themselves. Jirachi is sleeping somewhere in the stars. It will wake again. You just have to wait. Fact 67. Absol, the disaster-predicting Pokémon from Generation 3, is based on a category of creature found across multiple Asian folklore traditions, the creature that appears before catastrophe. In Chinese and Japanese folk belief, unusual animal sightings, cranes flying south out of season, foxes gathering in unusual places, dogs howling at midnight, were interpreted as warnings of coming disasters. Absol appears before earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters, drawn toward the location where the catastrophe will occur. The Pokédex notes that for centuries, people blamed Absol for the disasters itself, rather than recognizing it as a harbinger. This is the story of every oracle and prophet in any tradition. The one who warns is blamed for what they could not prevent. Fact 68. Yamata no Orochi, the 8-headed serpent from Japanese mythology slain by the god Susanoo, is the probable inspiration for Hydreigon. Hydreigon is a 3-headed dark dragon with 6 wing-like arms. Its prevolution, Deino evolves into Zweilous at level 50, which has 2 heads. The progression, 1 head, 2 heads, 3 heads, and the Dark Typing Mirror, the ancient dragon of Japanese mythology that required a hero to defeat through strategy and cunning rather than direct combat. The mythological Orochi had to be made drunk on sake before Susanoo could approach. Hydreigon is given a reputation in the Pokédex as a creature that destroys anything it perceives as a threat. Both dragons require an approach that accounts for their fundamental nature rather than confronting them head-on. Fact 69. Dialga and Palkia, the legendary Pokémon of time and space from Generation 4, draw from the Shinto creation myth of Japan. In the Kojiki, the oldest chronicle of Japanese history and mythology, the universe begins in chaos, and the first acts of creation involved the separation of earth and sky, the structuring of time, and the establishment of physical space as distinct from the formless void. Arceus, the god Pokemon who creates Dialga and Palkia, functions as a Shinto creator deity, bringing form and order to nothing. The three pillars of the Diamond and Pearl mythology, time, space, and the creator above both, map directly onto the Shinto cosmological structure that underpins Japanese civilization. What the Generation 4 mythology accomplished was to give the Pokemon world a creation story that was genuinely mythologically literate. Previous games had hinted at the existence of Pokemon that shaped the world. Groudon and Kyogre in Generation 3, the Regi Trio in their ancient ruins. But Diamond and Pearl stated it plainly. The universe you are standing in was made by a creature, and that creature can be caught in a Pokeball. The audacity of that premise, presented to players as a turn-based RPG on a handheld device, is something that only becomes fully visible when you trace the Shinto cosmology underneath it. Fact 70. Volcarona, the fire/bug legendary adjacent Pokemon from Generation 5, is rooted in the imagery of the sun itself. Its Pokédex entry in Pokemon Black states that when volcanic ash darkened the atmosphere in ancient times and blocked sunlight from reaching the earth, Volcarona flew across the sky, scattering fire to replace the lost light. In multiple religious traditions, including Zoroastrianism, ancient Mesopotamian religion, and various solar cults across Asia, the sun is sustained by an act of will, a fire maintained against the threat of cold and darkness. Volcarona is the creature that kept the world warm when the sky failed. Its design, with its 6 enormous wing scales that look like solar petals, reads as a Pokemon version of a sun deity. The Pokédex entry for Volcarona is also a piece of genuine ecological imagination. The scenario it describes, a volcanic winter caused by ash blocking the sun, requiring an alternative source of warmth, is a real catastrophic phenomenon that has occurred multiple times in Earth's history. The inclusion of this geological reality in the lore of a bug-type Pokemon in a game marketed to children is one of the quieter examples of Game Freak's writers trusting their players with more weight than the franchise's cheerful surface usually suggests it contains. Section 8. The Trading Card Game's Buried Secrets. The Pokemon trading card game launched in Japan in 1996 and arrived in North America in December 1998 under the Wizards of the Coast publishing banner. What most players experienced was a straightforward card game with attractive art and simple rules. What existed underneath the surface of that experience was a production process, a collecting subculture, and a mythology of error and rarity that has spent nearly 30 years generating stories. The interesting thing about the Pokemon TCG's history is that its most valuable artifacts are often the things that went wrong. The most sought-after cards in collector markets are not always the most powerful cards in the game. They are frequently the misprints, the early print runs, the cards produced under conditions of impossible demand by a manufacturing infrastructure that was never designed to handle what Pokemon became. The history of the Pokemon card game, read through the lens of its error cards and its print variations, is a record of a product being overwhelmed by its own success, and leaving beautiful anomalies behind in the process. Fact 71. The Shadowless cards are the rarest mass-market print run of the original base set, and most collectors had them without knowing it. When Wizards of the Coast printed the first English-language Pokemon cards in 1998 and early 1999, the initial limited print run lacked the drop shadow effect around the artwork box that later became standard. These are called Shadowless cards. If you opened a booster pack in those first few months of the card game's American release, your cards were shadowless. If you opened a pack from a box purchased at a department store 6 months later, they were not. The visual difference is subtle, a slight shadow on the right edge and bottom of the illustration box. But the value difference in the collector market today is enormous. A first edition Shadowless Charizard in near mint condition has sold at auction for prices that would have seemed implausible to any child who kept their Charizard in a plastic sleeve and a 3-ring binder. The fact that the scarcity was accidental, that Shadowless cards existed simply because Wizards ran out of first-run stock before the demand was met and shifted to a different print process, makes the collector market around them feel like a genuine archaeological discovery. Fact 72. The Ninetales holographic from the base set was printed in a shadowless variant that is missing its damage value for the Fire Blast attack. The attack's text is there, the formatting is there, but the actual number that tells you how much damage it deals is absent. These cards were distributed in specific theme decks, the Brushfire deck, rather than booster packs, which means they reach players in a more controlled and traceable way. Finding a copy of this misprint today requires navigating the secondary market carefully, but it exists in verified quantities and represents one of the more interesting production errors of the early card game era. Fact 73. The Ghost Stamp Pikachu, sometimes called the Pikachu with the Phantom Stamp, is a shadowless Pikachu card from the base set that shows an outline where the first edition stamp should be, as though the stamp was applied and then removed, or as though the ink partially failed. The result is a ghost impression, visible if you tilt the card toward a light source, of the first edition marking that was never fully printed. These cards came from specific Zap theme decks and are documented well enough that collectors have assigned them a category. Whether the ghost impression resulted from a defective stamp tool or from a production error in the ink application is not definitively established. Fact 74. The Ancient Mew promo card distributed in theaters during the Pokémon 2000 movie in 1999 and 2000 was printed with text in a runic-style pseudo-language that resembled ancient script. Most players who received it assumed it was purely decorative. It was not entirely. The text on the card was translatable. Researchers eventually decoded it as Pokémon's invented unknown alphabet applied to English words. When translated, the card read as a genuine Pokémon card with real stats and an attack. Certain competitive tournament formats at the time were not entirely clear about whether promo cards were legal, and some tournament directors briefly considered the Ancient Mew's status before official rulings confirmed it was not tournament legal. Some players had received what they thought was a collectible movie souvenir and discovered they were holding a card with actual printed effects that had never been formally evaluated for balance. Fact 75. The first edition stamp on base set cards was not applied uniformly across the entire initial print run. There are documented cases of cards from the same production batch where some copies received the stamp and others did not, creating an inconsistency that only becomes visible when you compare copies side by side. This happened because the stamping was done as a secondary process. Cards were printed first, then stamped, and the mechanical stamping process was not perfectly calibrated to catch every card in the press. Fact 76. In the late 1990s, a rumor spread through the Pokémon card-playing community that Psychic-type cards were cursed. The rumor cited their purple color as evidence of supernatural association and claimed that decks heavily reliant on Psychic types were prone to losing. Wizards of the Coast issued statements explicitly addressing the rumor. The fact that a major card game publisher felt compelled to publicly state that their cards were not cursed says something remarkable about the intensity of Pokémon's cultural moment. The franchise had penetrated deeply enough into the everyday lives of children that the line between game mechanics and folk belief had genuinely blurred. The Psychic curse rumor is part of a broader pattern in early Pokémon fandom, where the game's supernatural themes bled into the real world. Children who played Pokémon were simultaneously playing a game about friendship and adventure and absorbing a world filled with ghost types, psychic entities, and creatures whose Pokédex entries sometimes read like horror stories. The Psychic cards were purple and associated with mental powers and darkness. Of course they were cursed. The game had told children that psychic power was mysterious and dangerous. Why would the cards be any different? Fact 77. There is an extremely rare base set Blastoise that is missing the word stage from its evolution box. The card text reads simply 2 where it should read stage 2. These were found in unlimited print booster packs, meaning they appeared after the initial shadowless run, and exist in documented quantities. The no-stage Blastoise is considered one of the more unusual base set variants because it affects the functional text of the card, rather than a cosmetic element like border shadow or HP formatting. Fact 78. The Japanese Pokémon trading card game launched about 2 years before the English version, and had its own distinct error cards and regional variants that Western collectors have often overlooked. Japanese cards from the earliest sets have different dimensions, different textures, and different rarity distributions. Some Pokémon that were extremely common in the Japanese TCG were significantly rarer in the English release, and vice versa, because Wizards of the Coast adjusted print distributions independently of the Japanese publishing structure. Japanese base set cards use a different symbol system to indicate rarity, circles, diamonds, and stars, rather than the common, uncommon, and rare designations in Western sets. The original Japanese Charizard had a different holographic treatment than the English version, with a more subtle sheen that collectors consider distinct from the English printing. For decades, the Western collector market barely engaged with Japanese vintage cards because language barriers made them harder to research. As the collector community matured and expanded internationally, the depth of the Japanese card market's own history became better understood and significantly more valued. Fact 79. The printing presses used for the original Pokémon base set cards were running at maximum capacity from essentially the moment the game launched internationally. The demand for cards was so far beyond any projection that the printing infrastructure simply could not keep up. This is part of why multiple print runs with different characteristics, Shadowless, Unlimited, UK regional prints, were produced in rapid succession. Each new print run represented the printers catching up with demand while making incremental adjustments to the production process. The UK regional print of the base set has different borders from the North American version. In the very earliest UK distribution, cards were packaged in a wrapper format that differed slightly from the American booster pack. These regional production variations were produced under so much commercial pressure that quality control was difficult to maintain consistently. The result is a landscape of variation within the base set that collectors have spent years mapping, not because each variation is dramatically different, but because the aggregate of small differences tells the story of what happens when a product becomes a phenomenon before anyone was prepared for it. Fact 80. Collector interest in the Pokémon TCG experienced a significant resurgence in 2020 and 2021, driven partly by YouTube content creators opening sealed vintage product. This created a secondary gold rush in sealed booster boxes and individual graded cards from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Auction houses that had never previously handled video game or trading card collectibles began running dedicated Pokémon lots. A graded first edition, base set Charizard sold for over $420,000 at auction in 2022. The market for objects that children once kept in shoeboxes had become, in the space of a few years, genuinely comparable to traditional art markets. The interesting question underneath this resurgence is not about money. It is about what Pokémon cards represent to the people who are suddenly paying extraordinary sums for them. The answer, largely, is childhood. The base set as Charizard is not a beautiful piece of art in the way a painting or sculpture is. It is a record of a specific experience, of tearing open a foil pack at a card shop counter or at a birthday party, of the specific sound of the booster pack opening, of the hope that the holographic would be the right one. People are paying for the memory attached to the object. In this sense, the Pokémon card market is also the memory market, and it has been operating in the hundreds of thousands of dollars at its peak. Section 9. Anime Production Secrets They Never Told You. The Pokémon anime began airing on TV Tokyo on April 1st, 1997, which is to say it began on April Fool's Day, though no one at the time knew what it would become. What started as a promotional vehicle for a modestly successful Game Boy game became one of the longest-running animated series in history. And throughout that run, the decisions that shaped the show, who would be Ash's partner, who would travel with him, whether the show would even continue past its first season, were made and remade constantly in response to audience feedback, production constraints, and executive decisions that often had nothing to do with storytelling. The thing to understand about the Pokémon anime's production history is that it was always, from the beginning, a commercial vehicle that learned how to be a meaningful story. It was designed to sell games and merchandise. It became something more than that through a combination of talented voice performances, writers who found genuine emotion in the premise, and an audience that brought their own feelings about friendship and growing up and leaving things behind to a show about pocket monsters. The production secrets in this section are not just trivia. They are a window into how something designed to be disposable became something people remember for the rest of their lives. Fact 81. Ash's first partner Pokémon was almost a Clefairy, not a Pikachu. This is documented in early anime production materials and supported by the manga adaptation Pokémon Pocket Monsters, which began before the anime and featured Clefairy as the protagonist's main companion. The producers made a late decision to switch to Pikachu for two reasons. Pikachu's design tested better across gender demographics and audience surveys, and electric powers produced more visually exciting battle sequences on screen. A bolt of lightning is more dynamic animation than whatever Clefairy would have done. The decision was pragmatic. The result was Pikachu becoming the most recognizable animated character in the world. There is something both mundane and profound about this. The most globally recognized animated character of the late 20th century, the yellow mouse whose image appears on lunchboxes and airplanes and Thanksgiving parade floats, was not chosen for narrative reasons. It was chosen for market research and for the technical convenience of animating electricity. The character who became a cultural institution was at the selection stage simply the better demographic bet. Fact 82. Misty was originally pitched to network executives as a potential protagonist rather than a companion. In the early planning stages for the anime, there was a version of the show where the female character was the central trainer, catching Pokémon, pursuing gym badges, while a male character played a supporting role. The pitch was rejected by the network on the grounds that a male protagonist would sell better internationally. This was a standard calculation for the time and was not unique to Pokémon. But the specific document history of Misty's potential centrality to the series means that the character viewers got, fiery, capable, sometimes overshadowing Ash, is a diluted version of what she was originally imagined to be. Fact 83. Brock was never meant to be a long-term companion. The production plan in the very early writing phase was to rotate Ash's travel companions every few episodes to showcase different gym leaders and give the show geographic variety. Brock's specific personality, the elder brother warmth, the deadpan delivery, the cooking skills, the comedic romantic obsession, proved so popular with audiences that the rotation plan was abandoned. Brock stayed, and the formula that emerged, one male companion, one female companion traveling with Ash, became the template the show used for decades. Fact 84. When Brock left the show during the Orange Islands arc, his absence was originally meant to be permanent. Tracy Sketchit, the Pokémon observer who replaced him, was designed as a new long-term companion who would carry the series forward into the new region. Fan response in Japan and the United States was significantly cooler toward Tracy than toward Brock, and international producers eventually requested Brock's return for the Johto series. He came back. Tracy faded into a recurring minor character. The whole episode demonstrates how audience reception, rather than production intention, often drives narrative decisions in long-running series. Tracy himself, looked at carefully, is an interesting character who never got the chance to develop fully. He was a sketch artist and Pokémon observer, a different kind of companion from Brock's caretaker role, or Misty's combative energy. A show that had developed Tracy might have explored the idea of someone who studies Pokémon rather than battles them, who approaches the world as a naturalist rather than a competitor. That version of the show was ended by audience feedback before it began. Fact 85. Ash was originally scripted to win the Indigo League. The final battle of the first season, in which Ash faces a trainer named Richie, had an alternate version where Ash won the championship and became the Kanto region's Pokémon master. Executive producers decided against this outcome, on the grounds that resolution would reduce the forward momentum of the series. A champion Ash had nowhere to go. A Ash who had fallen short had every reason to keep traveling, keep growing, keep trying. The loss became the engine of the narrative for 25 years until Ash finally won a world championship in the anime's 100th season period before the character was retired. Fact 86. Ash's Charizard was planned to be disobedient permanently. The arc where Charmander evolved into Charmeleon, and then Charizard, and subsequently refused to obey Ash in battle, was written as a running character note rather than a temporary story beat. The writers intended Charizard's defiance to be an ongoing, unresolved tension, the reminder that not every relationship between a trainer and their Pokémon is straightforward. Audience backlash against Charizard's continued failure to cooperate eventually led to the decision to give him a redemption arc, culminating in the Charizard Chills episode, where Ash stays up all night warming Charizard after the Pokémon is badly hurt in battle. The disobedient Charizard became the loyal Charizard. The arc that was supposed to have no resolution got one. The Charizard Chills episode is worth singling out as one of the most emotionally effective pieces of Pokémon animation in the original run. The image of Ash sitting in the cold through the night, refusing to leave, slowly winning back the trust of a creature that had written him off. It is a simple story told without sentimentality, and it works exactly because the preceding episodes had made the estrangement between them feel real. The loyalty earned at the end of that episode is heavier and more valuable than any loyalty that was never tested. Fact 87. Meowth's ability to speak human language was not in the original script. The Japanese voice actress Inuko Inuyama began improvising a specific quality of delivery, a kind of streetwise, vaguely theatrical dignity that gave the character a personality beyond what was written. This specific reading was so appealing to writers and audiences that Meowth was given significantly more screen time than originally planned, and the character's speaking ability became central to his lore. An entire episode of the anime was later dedicated to explaining how Meowth learned to talk, which is one of the most melancholy and unexpectedly moving episodes in the series. That episode, Go West Young Meowth, reveals that Meowth taught himself to walk upright and speak human language for love. He was in love with another Meowth named Meowsy, who rejected him for living like a common Pokémon. He decided to make himself worthy of her. He spent months watching humans speak, learning word by word, failing, and starting again. And when he finally went back to Meowsy and spoke to her, she rejected him again, told him that now he was even more of a freak. The Speaking Meowth, the most lovable member of Team Rocket, was created by heartbreak. He carries that origin in every scene he appears in. Fact 88. James of Team Rocket comes from an extraordinarily wealthy family. This was intended by early writers as a recurring thematic element. The rich boy who chose crime and freedom over the comfortable, controlled life his parents had planned for him. The storyline appeared in a handful of episodes, where James returns to his family estate or encounters figures from his wealthy past, but the full arc was never developed. The character remained primarily comedic, and the class tension at the heart of his backstory, what does it mean to choose poverty and adventure over inherited wealth, was largely left unexplored. Fact 89. The Pokémon anime almost ended after the Indigo League. The production team was not certain, in the early months of the show's run, whether the series would be renewed beyond its first arc. Plans were drafted to wrap the story with Ash returning home to Pallet Town after the tournament, completing his journey in a way that felt satisfying. The explosive commercial success of the franchise through the trading card game and merchandise lines made cancellation impossible by the time those plans were fully written, but the fact that they existed at all means the Pokémon anime we have today, over 25 seasons, thousands of episodes, multiple generations of traveling companions, was nearly a 12-episode story about a boy and his Pikachu. Fact 90. The English opening theme Gotta Catch 'Em All does not accurately reflect the Japanese opening theme's content. The Japanese opening for the original series, Meizei Pokemon Master, translates roughly to aim to be a Pokemon master, and focuses on the theme of friendship, adventure, and the bond between trainer and Pokemon. The English adaptation reframed the entire premise around collection, the Catch Them All slogan, which suited the toy and card game marketing strategy, but shifted the show's stated purpose from growth and connection to accumulation. The two themes are not opposing, but they emphasize different aspects of the same story, and the distinction shaped how two different generations of fans understood what Pokémon was about. This difference is not a small one. Children who grew up with the English theme believed, in some foundational way, that Pokémon was about catching every creature and completing the collection. Children who grew up with the Japanese theme believed it was about becoming the best through effort and friendship. Both narratives are present in the games and show, but which one you receive first shapes which one you instinctively reach for when someone asks you to describe what Pokémon means to you. Section 10. The hidden game mechanics. Almost no one found. Pokémon has always been more mechanically complex than it appears on the surface. The games are designed to be accessible. A child can finish the story campaign with minimal strategic thought, relying on type advantages and level grinding. But underneath that accessible surface is a machinery of hidden numbers, invisible statistics, and unintuitive systems that have occupied competitive players and researchers for decades. What makes these hidden mechanics interesting is not just that they exist, but that they were rarely accidents. The IV system, the EV system, the nature system, the friendship system, these are all deliberate design decisions. Game Freak chose to build depth beneath the surface rather than on top of it. They designed games that could be enjoyed by a 6-year-old and studied by a 26-year-old and reveal something different to each. The hidden layer of Pokémon is a reward for curiosity. The game never tells you it is there. It simply waits. The most revealing thing about Pokémon's hidden mechanics is how consistent the philosophy behind them has been across 30 years. Generation after generation, the games contain systems that casual players will never see, and that competitive players will spend hundreds of hours mastering. This is not an accident of design. It is a deliberate choice to create a game that contains multiple games inside itself, one that appears on the surface to be a simple adventure about friendship and defeating gym leaders, and one that operates beneath that surface as a precise and deeply mathematical optimization problem. The two versions of the game coexist in every cartridge. Every player experiences one of them. Only a fraction ever knows the other one is there. The hidden mechanics also created the competitive community that has surrounded the franchise for decades. Without IVs and EVs, without natures and hidden power, without the specific technical depth that the games never explain directly, there would have been nothing for that community to discover. The competitive Pokémon scene exists because Game Freak built secrets worth finding. The researchers and calculators and breeding guides and team-building spreadsheets that constitute the competitive infrastructure of modern Pokémon all trace back to a decision made in the 1990s to encode more depth into a game than any player could be expected to naturally find. Fact 91. The shiny Pokémon mechanic, introduced in Gold and Silver, was not a planned feature in the traditional sense. It emerged from a technical experiment. Developers working on the Game Boy Color's expanded color palette realized that they could swap a Pokémon's color data, flip the values that determined what colors each pixel displayed, without meaningfully increasing the game's memory footprint. The color flip was essentially free to implement. So they implemented it with a very low probability, tied to the DV values of the Pokémon, and created what players would come to call shinies. The entire mechanic, one of the most beloved and obsessive-compulsive elements in modern Pokémon, was born from a programmer noticing available memory capacity and doing something interesting with it. The first shiny most players ever encountered was the red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage in Gold and Silver, a scripted encounter designed to introduce the mechanic, since a 1 in 8,000 random chance meant many players might finish the game without ever seeing one naturally. That red Gyarados, coiled in the middle of a lake gone wrong, was the franchise's way of saying, "This exists, it is real, now go and look for it." Decades later, shiny hunting, the practice of resetting encounters or chain breeding thousands of eggs in pursuit of a single differently colored Pokémon, is one of the most practiced and most discussed activities in the entire community. It all started with a programmer noticing they had a few bytes to spare. Fact 92. The gender ratio of Azurill and Marill creates a genuinely strange biological anomaly in the game's coding. 75% of Azurill are female, but only 50% of Marill are female. This means that a significant proportion of female Azurill, roughly 1 in 3, evolve into male Marill. Gender is not stored as a fixed value during this evolution. It is recalculated based on the Pokémon's personality value during the evolution process itself. The result is a Pokémon that changes biological sex during evolution at a rate that would be scientifically remarkable if it were an actual creature. Game Freak acknowledged this as an unintentional consequence of the coding, and it was corrected in Generation 6, but for approximately 12 years, the Azurill gender flip was just a thing that happened. Fact 93. The nature system, introduced in Generation 3 and still present today, determines which stats of a Pokémon increase faster and which increase more slowly as the Pokémon levels up. There are 25 possible natures. 5 of them are neutral, affecting nothing. The other 20 each boost one stat by 10% and reduce a different stat by 10%. This system is invisible to casual players, who see only the nature's name, hardy, adamant, timid, modest, displayed on the Pokémon summary screen. The stat effects are real and significant in competitive play. A Pokémon with a timid nature has 10% more speed and 10% less attack than the same Pokémon with a brave nature. Over a Pokemon's life cycle, that difference compounds. The natures also come with secondary flavor indicators that are purely cosmetic but beautifully designed. A Pokemon with a timid nature likes sweet food and dislikes spicy food. A Pokemon with a brave nature likes spicy food and dislikes sweet food. These flavor preferences do absolutely nothing mechanical in most games and are never explained. They are just there, a small, quiet layer of personality written into a stat modifier. Someone at Game Freak thought that a Pokemon's relationship to food should be consistent with the psychological quality that its nature suggested. That level of detail in a system most players never notice is one of the reasons the franchise's world feels lived in even when you are not paying close attention. Fact 94. Effort values. The stat bonuses Pokemon accumulate from battling had a maximum of 255 per stat in generations 1 through 4, but the effective cap was actually 252. The system only counts effort values in multiples of 4 when calculating actual stat increases, meaning the 253rd, 254th, and 255th effort values in a stat contributed nothing. Competitive players who knew this could save 3 effort values and distribute them elsewhere. Players who did not know this were wasting 3 points per stat they maxed out. This distinction between the nominal cap and the functional cap was never explained in any in-game text in the games of that era. Fact 95. The hidden power mechanic in generations 2 through 6 allowed a single normal type move to function as any of the other elemental types depending on the Pokemon's individual values. Each combination of IVs mapped to a specific hidden power type and power level. A Gengar with specific IV combinations would have a hidden power fire that was genuinely useful for coverage. A Gengar with different IVs might have hidden power grass, which was less useful. Players who wanted a specific hidden power type for competitive purposes had to breed for specific IV combinations, which meant understanding both the IV system and the hidden power calculation formula, neither of which was explained in the game. The hidden power system created one of the most elaborate metagame rituals in Pokemon history. Players would breed hundreds of eggs, hatch each one, check the IVs through in-game calculators or external tools, and discard nearly all of them until the combination they needed appeared. A competitive player building a team with hidden power ice on a specific sweeper might spend hours or days on the breeding process before even starting to train the Pokemon itself. The system was removed in Generation 7 when the value of specific IVs became manually adjustable through hyper-training. Many competitive players mourned its absence, because the difficulty of obtaining the right hidden power had made the result feel earned in a way that hypertraining could not replicate. Fact 96. The friendship mechanic in Gold and Silver operates in intervals tied to step counts. The game calculates friendship increases in blocks of 256 steps. Walking exactly 256 steps triggers a friendship check that may increase a Pokemon's friendship stat. Walking 255 steps and stopping gains nothing. Walking 257 steps triggers the check once and leaves 1 step toward the next check. Most players who evolved Togepi into Togetic or raised Espeon through friendship did not realize they were optimizing their step count at all. They were simply walking through the game world, and the game was quietly rewarding them for it. Fact 97. The happiness-based evolution system means that giving a Pokemon bitter herbal medicine, like the heal powder or energy root used to restore status conditions in battle, actively reduces its friendship value and delays evolutions like Togepi's. The game never explains this. There is no tooltip that warns a player that using a more economical healing item will make their Pokemon like them less. Children who healed their sick Togepi with every herbal remedy they found in the game were inadvertently building resentment into a creature they wanted to evolve, and they had no way of knowing it. This mechanic has a certain uncomfortable poetry to it. The message embedded in the system, that how you treat a creature when it is vulnerable shapes your relationship with it, is not a bad lesson. The game was teaching empathy through consequence without ever stating it directly, but it was doing so in a way that punished players for not already knowing the lesson, which is a peculiar approach to teaching anything. Fact 98. The Pokeroo status condition, a beneficial infection that doubles the rate at which Pokemon accumulate effort values from battles, exists in the games from Generation 2 onward. Its base encounter rate is a quarter of the chance of finding a shiny Pokemon. In Generation 2, That meant a 1 in approximately 21,845 chance of a wild Pokémon you encounter having Pokerus. Most players who ever encountered it in the early games assumed it was a status ailment and rushed to heal it. The conditions tooltip describes it as a mysterious condition affecting Pokémon with no further context. Players who cured their Pokerus infected Pokémon immediately had unknowingly discarded one of the most valuable mechanics in competitive play. The community's discovery of Pokerus, its real function, its rarity, the fact that it spreads to adjacent Pokémon in your party, happened gradually through forum posts and player testing in the early 2000s. Once understood, infected Pokémon became extraordinarily valuable to share. Players would specifically seek out others who had Pokerus and arrange trades simply to receive an infected party member they could use to spread the condition through their team. A mechanic that looked like a negative status effect had become a coveted breeding and training resource, passed from player to player like a gift. Fact 99. In Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, the berry farming system was tied to the real-time clock, stored in the cartridge's internal battery. Berries planted in the ground grew in real time, requiring players to return after actual hours had passed to harvest them. When the internal battery of the Ruby and Sapphire cartridge died, which it began doing for many cartridges around 2004 and 2005, only a few years after release, the real-time clock stopped ticking and the berries stopped growing. Forever. Players who came back to the game with a dead battery cartridge found that all their berry patches had ceased to function. This was not a glitch. It was a hardware limitation that Game Freak had built a game mechanic around without anticipating the consequences of battery decay. Later releases eventually introduced workarounds and battery replacement tutorials, but thousands of players simply gave up on their berry farming and never understood why it had stopped working. The dead battery issue in Ruby and Sapphire is one of the more poignant technological artifacts the franchise produced, a game world that genuinely aged and ran down in the same way a real-world object does. The cartridge in a drawer for 10 years would eventually lose the ability to grow things, to track time, to maintain the living quality of the world it contained. There is something sad and strangely beautiful about that, even if it was an engineering oversight rather than a design intention. Fact 100, the wild area in Pokémon Sword and Shield. The open world section where wild Pokémon roam freely and weather conditions create different encounter opportunities was not a new idea. It was a delayed one. Developers at Game Freak have indicated in interviews that the concept of an open-world Pokémon exploration zone was experimented with as early as Generation 3, during the development of Ruby and Sapphire. The Game Boy Advance hardware could not support it. Subsequent generations were tried with the concept and found to face similar limitations. The wild area in Sword and Shield was the first time the hardware, the Nintendo Switch, was capable of delivering something close to what had been imagined over a decade earlier, and the wild area, in turn, became the foundation for the fully open-world Paldea of Scarlet and Violet, which was again a realization of a concept that had been waiting for the right hardware. The broader arc that the wild area represents, an idea carried forward through 4 or 5 generations of hardware, tested and shelved and tested again, finally realized when the technology caught up with the vision, is one of the clearest examples of how Game Freak's development philosophy works. They do not abandon ideas when the technology fails them. They file them away and wait. The Pokémon franchise's future has always been, in part, a filing cabinet of deferred dreams waiting for the right moment to be opened. Section 11. The decisions that built a franchise. Every franchise is shaped not just by what it became, but by the decisions that nearly sent it somewhere else. The choices that kept Pikachu instead of Clefairy, that kept Ash instead of a new protagonist, that kept Brock instead of Tracy. These were not inevitable. They were judgment calls made by real people under real pressure, sometimes for commercial reasons, and sometimes for artistic ones, and sometimes because an audience reaction came in and changed everything overnight. These are some of the most pivotal near misses in Pokémon history. There is a kind of vertigo that comes from looking at all of these close calls together. The franchise we know required not just skill and talent and effort, but a continuous stream of decisions going in the right direction. Any one of these choices going differently would have produced a different Pokémon. A permanent Mega Evolution mechanic would have fundamentally changed how players related to their teams, And Ash, who won the Indigo League at age 11, would have needed a completely different subsequent story. A Brock who was rotated out in the Orange Islands would have left a different emotional shape to the companion dynamic. The Pokemon we know is one specific path through a forest of possibilities. These are the paths not taken. Fact 101. Pokemon Yellow was the first game in the series to implement the feature, where Pikachu follows the player character on screen. It was a massive undertaking for the hardware, rendering a small animated sprite that tracked the player's movement and paused when the player paused and faced the player when interacted with. The plan in early development of Yellow was to extend this feature to all three original starters. A Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle would follow you depending on your choice. The Game Boy's processing limitations made this impossible. Only Pikachu, whose sprite was already optimized through the anime tie-in production, could be rendered this way without causing performance issues. The feature was tabled for over a decade and finally returned in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where all 493 Pokemon available at that time could follow the player through Johto. It was completed 2 generations later than it was first imagined. The following Pokemon mechanic, when it finally returned in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, was one of the most warmly received features in the franchise's modern era. Players described stopping in the middle of routes just to turn around and interact with their Pokemon. The small animation of your Pokemon looking back at you, the change in expression depending on their friendship level, the way a Ghost-type Pokemon would float slightly above the ground while following. These details communicated something about the relationship between trainer and Pokemon that stat screens and battle animations never could. It took the games until 2009 to deliver what Yellow had promised in 1998. Fact 102. The day and night cycle in Gold and Silver was nearly cut. The feature, which changed the color palette of the game world depending on the actual time kept by the cartridge's real-time clock, was experimental technology for a handheld device in 1999. Game Freak's technical team struggled with the memory requirements of storing multiple color palettes for each map location and almost convinced themselves to remove it. The internal debate ended when someone argued successfully that the day-night cycle was too central to the game's atmosphere to sacrifice. That decision defined not just Gold and Silver, but the direction of every mainline Pokemon game since. The idea that the game world was alive independently of the player, changing according to its own rhythms, became a foundational design value of the franchise. The day-night cycle also had a secondary effect that no one fully anticipated at the time. It made the game's world feel lonely, in a way the earlier games never had. Walking through a Krutik city at night, the streets quiet, the music shifting into something more melancholy, encountering Pokemon that only appeared after dark. This created an atmosphere that was genuinely different from anything in Red and Blue. The game rewarded players who were awake late. It acknowledged that some hours of the day had a different quality than others. Pokemon Gold and Silver were the first games in the series that understood what it felt like to be up past midnight, and they made something meaningful out of that knowledge. Fact 103. The Mega Evolution mechanic introduced in Pokemon X and Y was originally designed as a permanent transformation. Early concept art for Mega Evolutions treated them as a third stage in an evolutionary line. Mega Charizard would be the final form of Charizard, not a temporary battle mode. This would have had enormous implications for the game's balance, for the broader lore of evolution, and for how players related to their Pokemon. The decision to make Mega Evolution revert at the end of battle was made relatively late in X and Y's development cycle and changed the entire character of the mechanic from a transformation into a power-up. The temporary nature also created narrative tension. The question of when to Mega Evolve became a strategic consideration, which the permanent design would have eliminated. Fact 104. The original plan for Ash's Pikachu in the anime was to give it a distinct cartoon voice rather than just repeating Pika and variations thereof. Test recordings were made with Pikachu sounding like a more traditionally expressive cartoon character, using a wider range of sounds and inflections. The producers found that this version sounded wrong. It broke the sense that Pikachu was a creature rather than a character, undermining the specific kind of bond between human and animal that the show was trying to evoke. The decision to keep Pikachu's vocabulary simple, repetitive, and anchored in a single word was a carefully considered artistic choice that defined how the character would be perceived by audiences for generations. The simplicity of Pikachu's vocabulary turned out to be one of its most powerful qualities across cultures and languages. A Pikachu that said Pika needed no translation. Its emotional range was communicated through tone and the context of the scene rather than through words. This made Pikachu universally accessible in a way that a more verbally expressive character could never have been. The cartoon voice that was rejected was, in the specific sense of global reach, a wrong turn that the show's producers avoided at exactly the right moment. Fact 105. Pokémon Black and White were the games most explicitly designed to challenge players' assumptions about the franchise. Team Plasma's argument that keeping Pokémon in Pokéballs is a form of slavery, that trainers exploit creatures who would be better off free, was never seriously answered by the game's narrative. N, the character who voices this argument most eloquently, is presented sympathetically. Some gym leaders in early builds agreed with his position. The final game softened this significantly, making it easier for the player to dismiss the argument by revealing that Team Plasma's leadership had been manipulating N for their own purposes. But the original, more uncomfortable version, where the games asked a real question about their own premise and declined to comfortably resolve it, is visible in the structure of what survived. N himself is one of the most carefully designed characters in the franchise. He grew up in isolation, raised by Pokémon rather than humans, and genuinely cannot understand why anyone would want to keep a creature in a ball. His arguments are not the rationalizations of a villain. They are the sincere conclusions of someone who has lived inside the relationship between Pokémon and humans and found it troubling. The game presents him as someone who is wrong about the world, but right about his own experience of it, which is a more sophisticated characterization than most Pokémon games attempt. The version of Black and White that made his argument even stronger, that had gym leaders quietly agreeing with him, would have been a genuinely challenging piece of storytelling for a franchise marketed to children. That it was toned down is understandable. That traces of its ambition remain is part of why the game is still discussed. Section 12. The Legacy and What Came After. There is a number that matters here. Pokémon is the highest-grossing media franchise in recorded history, not the highest-grossing video game franchise, not the highest-grossing animated franchise, the highest-grossing franchise of any kind, in any medium that has ever existed. The cumulative revenue across games, anime, merchandise, trading cards, and the mobile phenomenon Pokémon Go is estimated at over $150 billion. That number surpasses Star Wars. It surpasses the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It surpasses Harry Potter. It surpasses every beloved cultural property you can name. This is not a story that was inevitable. It was a story that required a boy in the Tokyo suburbs who would not stop loving the things he loved, a programmer who found something interesting to do with empty memory slots, a voice actress who improvised a personality into a cat, a committee of executives who said yes when they could have said no. It accumulated from thousands of small decisions, most of which were made by people who had no idea they were building something permanent. Fact 106. Pokémon Go, released in July 2016, became the fastest mobile game in history to reach 50 million downloads, accomplishing this in 19 days. At its peak in the summer of 2016, the game had approximately 45 million daily active users in the United States alone. There were documented cases of traffic accidents caused by people playing while driving. Police departments issued statements. Businesses reported surges in foot traffic because they happened to be located near Pokestops. A real estate listing in New York City advertised proximity to a Pokestop as a selling point. None of this was predictable. The team at Niantic had conservative projections. They expected a hit. They did not expect to briefly become a documented contributor to national traffic statistics. What Pokémon Go did, in its peak weeks, was something no video game had previously managed on that scale. It got enormous numbers of people who had not thought of themselves as players of video games to go outside, walk around their neighborhoods, and interact with strangers over a shared digital experience. Parks that were normally empty in the evenings had hundreds of people in them. People who had not spoken to their neighbors in years found themselves comparing notes about which Pokestops were the best. The social consequence of the game in those first weeks was genuinely unprecedented, and it happened because Pokémon's premise, go outside, explore your world, find things waiting for you, was the right idea for the right technology at exactly the right moment. Fact 107. Pokemon Go originally contained code for a mechanic where wild Pokemon would flee into the real world, meaning they would appear on the map at a nearby physical location, and you would have to walk to that location to find them. The feature was cut before launch after the development team considered the safety implications of children chasing a digital signal across a street. The version of Pokemon Go that players experienced was, by design, safer and more static than the version first imagined. Fact 108. The Legends Arceus design, the open-world action-adventure Pokemon game released in January 2022, drew heavily on concepts that had been tested and abandoned during the development of Generation 3. The idea of a human character thrown into the historical past of the Pokemon world, observing Pokemon in their natural habitat before the trainer culture of the modern games existed, had been in development notes for years before the hardware could support it. Legends Arceus was not a new direction for the franchise. It was a deferred direction that had been waiting for the right conditions. The specific setting of Legends Arceus, the Hisui region, a historical version of Sinnoh before civilization had fully established itself, allowed Game Freak to explore a question the franchise had always implied but never directly addressed. What was the Pokemon world like before trainers existed? The answer the game proposed was a world where humans were frightened of Pokemon, where encounters were dangerous and unpredictable, where the relationship between people and creatures was something that had to be discovered and negotiated rather than assumed. It was a quieter, stranger, and in some ways more honest version of the Pokemon world than the gym leader and badge collecting loop had ever allowed. Fact 109. The story of Ash Ketchum in the anime concluded in 2023, when the character was written out after winning the World Coronation Series and becoming the world's greatest Pokemon trainer, the title he had been pursuing since 1997. The journey from Pallet Town to that moment took 25 years of real time, and the equivalent of many decades of story time. The fact that this resolution was possible at all, that a children's television character sustained enough audience investment across a quarter century to make his eventual triumph feel meaningful, is genuinely without precedent in animation history. New protagonists Liko and Roy now carry the anime forward. The final arc of Ash's story, in which he competed in the Masters 8 tournament, and ultimately the World Coronation Series, was produced with a care and emotional weight that the show had not consistently shown for decades. The battles were animated with unusual attention. The callbacks to earlier seasons were deliberate. The writers seemed to understand that they were closing something significant, and they tried to do it properly. Whether you grew up with the first season or the 20th, Ash's final win landed as a genuine ending, a full stop on a sentence that had been in progress for a generation. Fact 110. The Pokemon franchise has produced over 1,020 individual Pokemon species as of the most recent generations, up from the original 151. Each one has a complete biological profile, a classification, a weight, a height, a set of abilities, a cry, a set of moves it can learn, Pokédex descriptions written in multiple voices across multiple games, and often a real-world mythological or biological inspiration embedded in its design. The scope of the creative work involved in maintaining this world, in keeping it internally consistent, in finding new angles on the basic premise of a creature that can be caught in a small red and white sphere, is genuinely staggering when you look at it all at once. Ken Sugimori, who designed those first 151 creatures under enormous time pressure with minimal hardware to show them on, is still involved in the franchise's design direction. He has watched the creature count climb from 151 to over 1,000. He has seen the designs he made in the early 1990s become global icons and inspire generations of designers who grew up wanting to make something that felt like what he made. The journey from hand-drawn sketches in a Tokyo apartment to a franchise that now contains more individual species than many entire media universes is one of the more remarkable creative trajectories of the 20th century. Fact 111. The Pokédex entries have been written by different voice characters across the games. Sometimes the voice is scientific and dry. Sometimes it reads like a nature documentary. Sometimes, particularly in the Ghost and Dark type entries, it reads like the notes of someone who has seen something they cannot explain and is writing it down anyway. The cumulative Pokédex across all games is one of the strangest collaborative works of world building in modern fiction. Hundreds of entries across 30 years that add up to a portrait of a world that is beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, where the line between a monster and a person is thinner than it appears, and where a 10-year-old with 6 Pokeballs and a starting stipend of a few thousand yen is apparently the most qualified individual available to investigate all of it. Fact 112. The connection between the Pokemon TCG and the video games was never a given. When the trading card game launched, it was conceived as a separate product line that shared the aesthetic of the games, but had its own independent rules and economy. The decision to make them mutually reinforcing, to use the same creatures in both contexts, to build events and promotions that crossed between the two formats, was a strategic choice that compounded the franchise's cultural presence enormously. Every new set of cards extending the game's lore into new generations meant new art, new characterizations, new ways of seeing creatures the player thought they already knew. The card game also served as a kind of distributed art museum for the franchise. Each card was a small piece of original illustration, often depicting creatures and environments and poses the game's sprite-based or 3D graphics could not show. The card art for Charizard alone, across 30 years of sets, constitutes a small gallery of how different artists have interpreted the same creature differently. Some are grand and terrifying. Some are warmly domestic. Some are abstract. The card game gave the franchise's artists a canvas that the games themselves could not provide, and the result has been 30 years of Pokemon art that extends far beyond what the games ever showed. Fact 113. Pokemon's 25th anniversary in 2021 was accompanied by a major Pokemon Presents livestream presentation that included the announcement of multiple simultaneous projects spanning every platform and medium. The franchise had, by that point, become something that resisted any single description. It was a video game company and a card game publisher and an animation studio and a licensing empire and a museum exhibit and a competitive esport and a nostalgia property and a genuine ongoing creative endeavor, all simultaneously. The Satoshi Tajiri who turned over rocks looking for bugs in the weeds beside the highway had created a world where every imaginable thing could be a Pokemon waiting to be found. Fact 114. There is a building in Sapporo, Japan, that has been converted into an unofficial Pokemon landmark because its exterior has colored dots that fans determined resemble the pattern on a Pokeball. Game Freak did not put this there. The building predates Pokemon, and yet people travel specifically to photograph it. The franchise has become so embedded in its home country's landscape that the landscape itself, in certain lights, at certain angles, begins to look like Pokemon. The world outside has started to resemble the world inside. That is what happens when an idea gets deep enough into a culture. Fact 115. Pikachu has appeared in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade balloon program since 2001, making it one of the longest-running balloon characters in the parade's history. The balloon has been updated multiple times as Pikachu's official design evolved. Seeing a 7-story tall yellow mouse floating above 6th Avenue in New York City every November has become, for millions of Americans, simply a part of what the holiday looks like. Satoshi Tajiri grew up watching insects in a Tokyo suburb. One of the insects became a yellow mouse. The yellow mouse became a Thanksgiving float. The chain of cause and effect between those two things is one of the stranger stories in the history of culture. And when you pull back far enough to see the full shape of what was built, 30 years of games, thousands of episodes of television, hundreds of millions of cards, a mobile game that briefly made people look up from their phones and start exploring their own neighborhoods, what you are really looking at is the record of a very simple idea, pursued with extraordinary stubbornness, that the feeling of finding something wonderful in the natural world and wanting to share it with a friend was worth building a universe around. Satoshi Tajiri had that feeling as a boy in a suburb of Tokyo, and he never let it go. Everything that followed was consequence. The final thought, 100 facts, 100 small windows into the larger story of a franchise that has been running for 30 years and shows every sign of running for 30 more. What strikes me most, looking at all of this at once, is not the scale of it. It is the fragility. How many times did Pokemon almost not exist, or not exist in the form we know it? Tajiri almost quit. Nintendo almost canceled it. Pikachu almost stayed Clefairy. Brock almost rotated out after a few episodes. The anime almost ended after one season. The day and night cycle almost got cut from Gold and Silver. The open world almost remained a concept in a developer's notes. Every version of Pokémon that almost happened but didn't is a ghost version of the franchise walking alongside the one we got. In that sense, the real Pokémon world is richer and stranger than the one in the games. It contains all the paths not taken, all the Pokémon that were designed and discarded, all the episodes that were written and never aired, all the mechanics that were coded and removed before anyone could play with them. Think about what we went through tonight. We started with a boy lying in the grass in the suburbs of Tokyo, watching insects move through it, and ended with a 7-story balloon floating down 6th Avenue in New York City. In between, we passed through memory addresses and phantom stamps, through mushrooms that eat their hosts and foxes with 9 tails, through children who believed there was something extraordinary under a truck, and were not entirely wrong, through a Pikachu that once had a different voice, and a Meowth that taught himself to speak from heartbreak, through a card game that accidentally created one of the strangest collector markets in history, through a carp that became a dragon, and a wish that waited 1,000 years to be granted. All of it connects. Every obscure fact in this video is a thread running back to the same place. A small team building, something they didn't know would last, caring about the details in the way that only people who love what they're making can. The invisible PC in Celadon City is a detail that no one was supposed to find, left behind by someone copy-pasting map data under time pressure. The Absol who is blamed for the disaster it came to warn about is a piece of mythology embedded in a Pokémon entry that most players scan and forget. The red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage is 1,000 years of Chinese mythology compressed into a scripted encounter. None of these things were required. All of them were done anyway. This is the thing that makes Pokémon, specifically, feel so different from other franchises of equivalent scale. It is full of evidence that the people making it cared. They didn't have to write 1,000 Pokédex entries across 30 years that add up to a coherent and sometimes genuinely disturbing world. They didn't have to embed folklore and science and mythology and grief and humor into what is nominally a game about catching creatures in spheres. They didn't have to hide Mew in 300 bytes 3 weeks before ship. They didn't have to make Meowth's origin story sad in exactly the right way. They did all of these things because they were building a world, and they took the world seriously even when the industry around them treated it as a product. And maybe that is why these facts matter. Not because they are trivia, but because each one is a small piece of evidence that the world you loved was built with intention and care, and sometimes with secrets deliberately left for you to find. And sometimes with secrets left behind accidentally that turned out to be even better than the intentional ones. A franchise can be many things. Pokémon has always been, at its core, an act of genuine attention to a world. Tonight we paid some attention back. The next time you pick up a cartridge or open the app or shuffle a deck of cards, you are holding something that nearly didn't make it. And that fact, if you sit with it for a moment, makes it feel more precious. Take care of yourselves tonight. Rest well. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you, genuinely. These long ones take real work, and your time watching means everything. Leave a comment with your favorite fact from this video. I read every single one. There is something specific that would be wonderful to know. Did any of these change the way you see a Pokémon you have always loved? Did you learn something tonight that you'll think about the next time you play? That is what this is all for. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we post. These relaxing deep dives will keep coming, and there is so much more to cover. The franchise is 30 years old and still generating secrets. The fans are still finding things in code that nobody noticed for decades. The stories behind the stories are still being told, one careful video at a time. See you in the next one.